Thank you.
Set.
Yep.
I guess they had 3 minutes.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Lawrence City Commission meeting. We're going to start out today. I guess we're there now, huh?
Here's some.
With a couple of proclamations. We've got one for the 28th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I believe we have some people here to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of the City Commission. My name is Ron Miller. I'm with the Accessible Task Force of Independence, Inc. We are here to receive the proclamation, and after we receive that, I have some comments.
Go ahead and make your comments.
Oh,
We'll
okay,
end with the
comments
proclamation.
first?
Yeah, you're up first.
Well, we appreciate the work of the City of Lawrence. Yesterday at our monthly meeting, we had Tammy Bennett, Jessica Mortinger, and Amanda Sayan meeting with us to find ways that we can collaborate for the transitional plan for the American with Disabilities Act. And they are beginning work now and hope to complete that next summer. So it's going to be a very detailed, long-term project that we believe will help move us into the next decades. That as the City of Lawrence continues to grow, we know that we all are going to get a little older, and the time will come, as it is in the country at large, that 20% of all Americans will be living with some sort of a disability. So we appreciate the work of the Commission. I have had the pleasure of working with Matthew Herbert on a personal basis. We've had some good discussions. And so I'd like to invite him and all the commissioners to a time that we could get together and study and see how we can continue to learn and make things happen for all citizens in our community. Many have unseen disabilities. So I know we have a lot to learn, and we stand ready to help you in every way that we can.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. I'll go ahead with the proclamation. Whereas the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, was passed on July 26, 1990 to ensure the civil rights of people with disabilities. This legislation established a clear and comprehensive national mandate for the elimination of discrimination against individuals with disabilities. And whereas the ADA has expanded opportunities for Americans with disabilities by reducing barriers and changing perceptions and increasing full participation in community life. However, the full promise of the ADA will only be reached if we continue our efforts to fully implement it. And whereas on this day, we in the city of Lawrence, Kansas, celebrate and recognize the progress that has been made by reaffirming the principles of equality and inclusion and recommitting our efforts to reach full ADA compliance. Now, therefore, I, Stuart Boley, Mayor of the City of Lawrence, Kansas, do hereby proclaim July 17th, 2018 to be the City of Lawrence, Kansas celebration of the 28th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act Day.
I asked Drew White to help me out with transportation.
Thank you.
Hey, Drew, how you doing?
If you have extras, you can put them back on the podium.
We were also provided copies of a booklet called Making Homes Visitable by one of our local celebrities, Dot Neri, PhD, who's in our audience here. And Dot told me that these are available in PDF, but I'm not sure exactly how people would get them. So maybe you can help us out.
Those are hot off the press, and the goal is for people with who mainly have mobility impairments, use wheelchairs, to be able to visit the homes of others, because it's very isolating not to be able to go for holiday dinners or cookouts, things like that. We will be doing a lot of publicity on it, and we'll have something in the Lawrence Journal World. But they are available at the Research and Training Center on Independent Living, but we'll make sure that that's available to the general public.
And thank you for providing us
Sure.
and to everyone.
Thank you.
Great. Okay. We have another proclamation. Roger.
Good evening, Mayor and Commissioners. Since 1985, the nation has celebrated Parks and Recreation Month. I look at it as we celebrate it every day here in Lawrence with all the activities that go on. But we set aside July as the month that we kind of recognize all the ways that people can keep active and live healthy, active lifestyles. You know, they could go swimming at the pool, maybe get up early and go for a nice workout and some laps around the track at SPL. They could take their dogs to the dog park. That's one of the busiest parks we have in town. It could be watching a Little League game out on the Holcomb Fields. You know, there's a lot of activities going on every day in Lawrence. We touch many lives. And as a department, we truly appreciate not only your service and for our benefit, but also all the citizens of Lawrence for providing us the necessary means to do what we do on a daily basis. We couldn't do it without your support. So to me, it's just, we celebrate every day, but this is just a special day or a special month that the nation set aside to really celebrate Parks and Recreation and what they mean to a community.
Thank you, Roger. Whereas Parks and Recreation programs are an integral part of the City of Lawrence, and its recreation opportunities help maintain the quality of life in our community, ensuring the health and wellness of all citizens, and contributes to its economic and environmental well-being. And whereas Parks and Recreation programs build a healthy, active community that aid in preventing chronic disease, provide therapeutic recreation services for those who have special needs, and improves the mental and emotional health of all citizens. And whereas our parks and natural recreation areas ensure the ecological beauty of our community and provide a place for children and adults to connect with nature and space outdoors, to recreate, and the City of Lawrence recognizes the benefits derived from parks and recreation resources. Now, therefore, I, Stuart Boley, Mayor of the City of Lawrence, Kansas, do hereby proclaim the month of July 2018 to be Parks and Recreation Month. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll now move on to the consent agenda. All matters listed below on the consent agenda are considered under one motion and will be enacted by one motion. There will be no separate discussion on those items. If discussion is desired, that item will be removed from the consent agenda and will be considered separately. Members of the public wishing to speak to an item that's been pulled off the consent agenda will be limited to 3 minutes for comments. And we have a clock right over here. So, we have one item that has been deferred, number 9, is that correct? Is there any item that a member of the commission would like to remove for separate consideration? Is there anything that a member of the public would like to remove for separate consideration? Okay. I'd entertain a motion.
So moved.
I would move that we adopt the consent agenda, including all claims.
Second.
We have a motion from Commissioner Herbert, second from Vice Mayor Larson. All in favor? Aye. That's unanimous. Now we'll take public comment. This is public comment on items that are not on the consent or regular agenda. The public is allowed to speak to any items or issues except those scheduled on the consent agenda or regular agenda portions of the agenda after first being recognized by the mayor. Each person will be limited to 3 minutes for public comment. As a general practice, the commission will not discuss or debate these items, nor will the commission make decisions on items presented during this time. Rather, they will refer the items to staff for follow-up if necessary. Individuals are asked to come to the microphone, sign in, and state their name and address. Speakers should address all comments and questions to the commission. So it's open for public comment.
Dan Dannenberg, 2702 University Drive. A few nights ago, I went for a walk on the Bircham Park Trail from the Burlington Northern Santa Fe tracks to the KU Boathouse. I had not been on that before, and I probably won't be going back. Off to the right, between the path and the river, were a number of geese, I believe, and these geese have no wariness of humans at all. And these geese had deposited numerous points of feces on the walk. Now, this seems like a trivial matter, except it's not healthy to have to walk through an area that is covered with avian feces. And I went on down to the KU Boathouse, and the dock down there was absolutely covered with it. It was all dry, but it was just absolutely covered. Since we're celebrating Parks and Recreation Month or whatever, I think we need to do something to make sure the geese are excluded. We don't need them to leave their droppings on a public walkway like that, because it's just not healthy and it's very unpleasant. I saw one man in bare feet. I hope he wasn't walking through that mess. It's one thing that you have to keep your eyes on the sidewalk on Massachusetts Street for dog doo-doo, but we don't need the geese leaving their deposits on this part of the trail. I guess eventually this will be part of the Lawrence Loopy-Loop, but it's not good, it's not healthy, it's not good for kids or even adults. So I hope Parks and Recreation can find some way to get the geese to exit stage left and not return.
Thank you, Dan.
Hello, my name is Sarah Merriman. I live at 6212 West 22nd Court. I am also co-owner of 812 Ohio Street. We purchased 812 Ohio in April of 2017. Within 4 weeks of purchasing the house, we learned that there is a 107-year-old, approximately 6-foot diameter stone stormwater line running through the backyard. That was not recorded on the deed nor discoverable by the title insurance company. In fact, it's not recorded anywhere that would be found during the real estate purchase process. The only place identifying this line is on the website the city created for its own use by its 10 departments, and the line was marked incorrectly. After months of trying to find out the exact location and depth of the line from the city, we hired an excavation company to locate the line. Through excavation, we determined the line actually runs directly under our house at a depth of 3.5 feet. The city's website map location was incorrect by approximately 40 feet. City staff stated that to obtain a building permit, we would have to sign a waiver indemnifying the city of any liability caused by the potential failure of this line. The existence of this line could impact our ability to sell our property in the future, and we already know of an adjacent home's potential sale that may be affected by the existence of this line and the damage it could be causing to the home that is for sale. The Stormwater Management Master Plan has been in place for 22 years, recognizing the need to reroute this 107-year-old line. But to date, the city is arguing that they have the right to have the line on our property and the properties of many others instead of working their plan to fix the problem. This property has been sold multiple times with no easement ever recorded. Ironically, if the city had properly recorded an easement according to where they thought it was, the line location for the easement would have been recorded inaccurately. None of our neighbors have this line shown on their titles as a recorded easement, and no one knew it ran directly under our house, not even the city. Residents of Lawrence should be able to be confident that when they purchase a property, there are no undocumented utilities. We ask the commissioners to request a review of the Stormwater Management Master Plan and to give the highest priority for the funding of the replacement of this 107-year-old line. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Donna Giesler. I live at 6212 West 22nd Court. I am also co-owner of 812 Ohio Street. In 1996, the city approved a stormwater master plan that laid out plans for needed stormwater projects all over the city. They were prioritized by need into 3 groups. Project 23, dealing with the 107-year-old line affecting our property, was originally categorized as a Group 2 project priority. But conditions over the past 22 years should now qualify this project to move to Group 1 priority. That is defined in the plan as recurring residential structure flooding as a result of the inadequacy of the existing storm drainage system. The master plan called for Group 1 priorities to be worked in as short a time as possible due to their critical nature. All 4 of these projects, and 4 of these projects, have still not been completed. The city stormwater management website showed that 8 of the 12 Group 1 projects were completed through 2005, but again, 4 have not been completed to date. In this same time period, no Group 2 projects were shown as completed, but 5 Group 3 projects were shown as completed. The website showed no master plan projects completed from 2006 to 2018. This project list has now been removed from the city's website. Staff did advise us in the last 2 weeks that 2 additional Group 3 projects were completed in 2015 and 1 Group 2 project was completed in 2017. The last flooding of the Ohio neighborhood took place 5 weeks ago today, on June 12th, with less than 1 inch of rainfall. Stormwater that overwhelmed the system from the 800 block of Ohio ended up flooding the basketball court at 7th and Tennessee again, to a depth of 5 to 10 feet before draining overnight. Stormwater backs up in this line in the 800 block of Ohio and overflows inlets in the areas in front of and behind houses on both sides of the street. Water gushes up out of the inlets, causing the concrete tops to be lifted off of their bases. The 8th and Ohio area is having frequent flooding. Recent expansion of structures in and around KU's Memorial Stadium could cause significant additional increases in stormwater runoff down this line. We want to work with the city to reach a solution that acknowledges the flooding issues and replaces this aging line. We request that the Stormwater Engineering Department review the need to reclassify this project to Group 1 priority per the criteria in the Stormwater Master Plan, and that the commissioners see this as a critical need and prioritize Project 23 for immediate funding. Thank you.
Thank you.
So the mic is closer. Thank you. This helps if you push the right button.
First off, thank you, Commissioners, for your time and effort in listening to what I had to share with you. My name is Tammy Sable, and my husband and I own and live at 815 Ohio Street. We have periodically had significant flooding in our yard due to the drain in the alley behind our house. When the rain comes too fast and are too hard, the water backs up in the drain to the point that it will actually lift and move the 5-inch concrete slab off the top of the drain. At times, the water is so significant that a geyser forms as a tall column of water gushes into the air. I used to park my car in the back of my house, which is approximately 50 feet from the water drain in our alley. In the last 12 months, my car has flooded twice, the second time on June 12th, when there was less than 1 inch of rainfall. Both times, I had to get my car professionally detailed, and in both instances, I was without a car for 7 days so that it could be completely dried out to remove any moisture. Needless to say, I no longer park there. Currently, there are neighbors who have had to make some constructural changes to their property in order to direct the flow of water towards Ohio Street and away from the drain behind my house in the alley. My husband and I met with our adjacent neighbors a few weeks ago to discuss a plan moving forward. At this time, we are considering putting in a French drain on the property line to try to redirect the water away from the drain in the alley. With this said, I would like to say that we are not engineers, and this is not our task to take on. For several years, every time it rains, we watch the alley, monitoring the drain to make sure nothing stops or hinders the flow of water. More than once, my husband, myself, and the neighbors have been outside during the rain to make sure the drain is clear. Once the flow of water starts to rise, it takes all the trash cans and their contents towards the drain, creating more of an issue. These items gather and hinder the flow of water because they block the drain. It becomes a big mess, and this process seems to be happening more often in recent years. More than that, this becomes a fearful activity of hoping the rain stops, that the rain will catch up to the flow of water, while all the time we are wondering if the water will rise high enough to go into our houses. I am here to ask that you make emergency funding available immediately to correct the problem. Thank you.
My name is Ben Hayes. I live at 800 Ohio Street, which I own with my partner, Laura Polvinelli, who is there. I'll just speak loud because I would like to use pictures. So this is the intersection of 8th and Ohio, and you will note the absence of any storm drains at any of the corners here. So in heavy rain, this entire area that is visible in the picture here can become flooded, so that you literally have one body of water which is lapping at the front steps of our home, the steps of the house across the street, and is draining on either side of our home down 8th Street and down the space between our house and the house next to us. It is draining toward this location behind our house, which is a storm drain connected to the 107-year-old line that you've been hearing about. And I have witnessed on the 12th of June water having backed up all the way to here, and a geyser, such as you just heard about in a different location, by the way, but a similar geyser erupting out of this manhole cover. Well, why is this water pooling, and why is water erupting out of this manhole cover? Well, here's the scene beneath the manhole cover, where this line, by the way, has been patched with concrete, but here gives to stone. And it is at this point 80 inches tall and 6 feet across. However, a little bit further down here, where the line actually goes underneath 8th Street, it narrows to this culvert, which is a mere 59 inches across, creating a net reduction of 43% of the volume capacity of the drain at that point. And so the pressure of all of that water coming downhill and meeting this narrowing is what's causing the backups and, as others have mentioned, these caps being physically moved by the force of the water, cracked and damaged, as you can see here. Furthermore, all of these conditions, because the water from Ohio Street having to drain somewhere and going down to this area where the drain is constricted, as I've just showed you, means that we have, in any serious rain, water coming down both sides of our house and entering our basement in abundance. We have had basement windows completely submerged with water pouring in. And I believe that the need for drainage remediation exceeds our capacity using civilian technology.
Thank you very much, sir.
Hi, I'm Laura Pavanelli. I live at 800 Ohio Street. I'm the co-owner with Ben. We bought this house a year ago. About a month after we bought the house, we experienced what I will call our first flash flood, which is the water pours in from the street over our curb and goes between our house and our neighbor's house and pours into our windows, into the basement. There was so much water coming in, we actually had no idea what was going on. It took us some time and several floods to figure out what was going on. The bottom line is this: anytime it rains, even just an inch, we get a flash flood into our basement. That's a third of our property that essentially we cannot use at this point in time, no matter what we do. The water, just as Ben described, the last time 1 inch of rain up to our bottom step of our house pouring here, flooding between our house and our neighbor's house, flooding behind our house this way. Honestly, I'm concerned my car is going to get swept away at some point. So we really are requesting that you all study this and fund the project that should have been funded 30-some years ago. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Pantaleon Flores. I'm a Lawrence resident at 1431 Chelsea Place. I came to the meeting last week and something was incredibly disturbing to me. I'm trying to think where to start with this. I guess I'm a teacher, and since I know I'm supposed to speak to all of you, even though it probably only pertains to 2 or 3 of you, I have to give the whole class a lesson. When you see a problem, specifically one regarding ADA compliance, say something. Don't wait to use it as a political argument against a group of artists who are doing something for the city for free. It just blows my mind that you would find, that you all, I guess, would find something wrong with compliance and accessibility about one of our public buildings, and then you would attempt to give that responsibility to a group of artists, not to the public library. It's not something you were like, oh, we should do this as a separate issue. When you see something, say something. When you say something in a position of power like you have, do something. All you need to do for that space is add a minimum 4 foot to maximum or required 6 foot piece of sidewalk. It's probably about a $500 project. I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Don't even have to make it city dollars if you want to make up for basically using a false argument of ADA compliance, or I don't know, maybe you were being just that ableist and using lack of compliance to kind of shoot down a group of women of color who are doing something for free for you all, by the way. And so it's also ironic that today we're celebrating the ADA when I'm standing here in front of a panel of people who last week tried to use it as a political argument against a group of women of color. Let's not do that anymore. Next time you find a space that's not very accessible, use your power. Do something. Don't just use it as a political argument. That's disgusting. Moving forward, I'm going to be speaking with Brad Allen, the executive director of the library. We've started a pretty good relationship. I've had a couple meetings with him. I'm going to talk to him about that space and about potentially widening that sidewalk so that it can be very accessible, as it should be and should have already been. There's also a set of metal bars there that I think would also potentially prohibit people from having full access to when the mural actually goes up. So I'll talk to him about why that's even there and see what I can do about that too. I would also just say that, you know, don't always rely on the public to do these things for you, especially when you're the one who brought it up and saw the issue of accessibility. So like I said again, see something, say something, in your position of power, do something. Thank you.
No, sorry. Just trying to get things back on track for me.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is KT Walsh, and I just wanted to clarify a couple things from last week that weren't, I may have given the wrong impression during the mural discussion. One is that the committee that did the mural review criteria and model contract, there were not just muralists on it. There was Kathy Porsche, who was the head of the Cultural Arts Commission at the time, and also works up at the Research and Development Office at the Hall Center for the Humanities, and Jerry Johnson, who owns Remedy Records and Neighborhood Studios, and is also a drone policy analyst. So Jerry Johnson and Kathy Porsche were the commissioners from the Cultural Arts Commission, and then Amber Hansen, Nicholas Ward, KT Walsh, and Dave Lowenstein, who are muralists, were on that committee. So that said, the other thing I just wanted to comment about keeping up with your murals. I have a mural at the Polar Building I did with Amber Hansen, and I had a 5-year repair and maintain contract. I have to take a dust mop down there every so often, so that's the maintenance there. The mural that we did with Jennifer Glenn and all the people who stay at the homeless shelter, the only thing that's happened, this is its 6th year, and it's outside, it's on heavy canvas, and it's covers the whole side of a semi-trailer. And the Kansas wind has pulled out one screw from the wood, and we're gonna go out and repair that. No fading, no scratches, no graffiti. I'm just saying, sometimes these things are left and admired, so thank you.
Thanks, KT. Other public comment?
My name is Phyllis Payne. I live at 3524 Tillerman Drive. Listening to the people here from the Ohio Street area, I know that area to be one of the most beautiful places in Lawrence. It's a beautiful block. I can only imagine that constant flooding and water damage has to be very damaging. In addition, based on everything else that was said tonight, I ask that you would consider funding this project. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Chris Flowers, and I just want to make a short comment. I know that at some point that marijuana issue is going to be coming up, and just last week how many people showed up for the mural discussion. I've been talking with my coworkers, and I think that marijuana, if it comes up, it has the potential to create the biggest meeting. So I was just wondering if the city could maybe make it its own little meeting, so just so that the other agenda items people won't have to be waiting like hours waiting hours through the marijuana discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Any other public comment? Okay, thank you very much. We'll move on to our regular agenda items. First item is to conduct a public hearing.
Good evening, Mayor and Commissioners. Dave Cronin, City Engineer. Staff received this request to vacate a 30-foot drainage easement along the east side of Lot 1 in Fall Creek's Farm, 12th Plat, also known as 104 North Wilderness Way. The intention for vacating the easement is to make the lot more buildable, so there has been a new drainage easement that has been dedicated along the east edge of the property. They have also submitted public improvement plans, and those have been approved to relocate the existing enclosed storm sewer that goes through this drainage easement that will be vacated. All utilities and property owners within 200 feet of this property were notified, and staff received no objections. And pending the public hearing, staff recommends approving the order of vacation. Stand for any comments.
Questions for David? Thank you, David. So I would entertain a motion to open a public hearing.
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion from Commissioner Ananda, second from Commissioner Herbert to open a public hearing. All in favor?
Aye.
Public hearing is open.
Move to close public hearing.
Second.
We have a motion to close the public hearing from Commissioner Herbert, second from Commissioner Ananda. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay.
Any comments?
Mhm. You got anything? Okay.
I move to approve the order of vacation.
Second.
Is that sufficient detail for you, Sherry? Okay. We have a motion from Vice Mayor Larson, second from Commissioner Herbert. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Second item. Consider the following items related to 2018 Live on Mass event number 3. We'll be conducting a public hearing, consider distance limitation waiver, and then secondly, consider approving a special event permit. Mark.
Good evening, Mayor, Commissioners. Mark Till, the Municipal Services Department. Tonight you're gonna, as you said, Mayor, conduct a public hearing to consider distance limitation waiver for the consumption, possession of alcohol in the public right-of-way. The church that was impacted by that distance has been notified, given their 30-day notice. We've not received any comments back from them. Also tonight, you will be adopting on first reading ordinance 9511, allowing the sale, possession, and consumption of alcohol in the public right-of-way. And I don't think I mentioned, this is in the 1000 block of Massachusetts. Also, you'll be approving a special event permit related to the private portion of the portion of the event on private property. The event organizer, Mike Logan, is here also if you have any questions.
Okay. Questions from Mark?
Nope.
Okay. I'd entertain a motion to open a public hearing.
Move we open a public hearing to consider distance limitation waiver request.
Second.
Okay. We have a motion from Commissioner Ananda, second from Commissioner Herbert. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. So we have, a public hearing is open for the Live on Mass number 3.
Move to close the public hearing.
Second.
We have a motion from Commissioner Ananda, second from Commissioner Herbert to close the public hearing. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Discussion.
I move we adopt on first reading ordinance 9511 allowing the sale, possession, and consumption of alcohol on the 1000 block of Massachusetts Street on the public right-of-way during the event.
Second.
We have a motion.
Sherry, do you want those together?
Yeah,
Both.
there's really three things.
Okay.
You can do them as one or separate. You need to, grant the distance limitation waiver, adopt on first reading the ordinance, and then, approve the special event permit.
So we can do it at once. Do we want to talk about the special event permit and then I'll do them all together?
That's fine.
Okay, then I will withdraw my motion.
You can just go ahead and amend your motion and read all of that. if
Do you
have
want to
any
talk about the
questions.
event?
Does
Oh,
anybody
are you
want
guys
to?
talking-
I just
oh,
wanted to
I'm
make sure that
sorry.
nobody
We
did
had-
Yeah,
before I
we
made the motion.
Thank you for.
Okay. Then, I move that we allow the distance limitation waiver and adopt on first reading ordinance 9511, and then allow approve the special event permit SE 1800291 on the 1000 block of Massachusetts Street and 1020 Massachusetts Street.
Second.
We have a motion from Commissioner Ananda, second from Vice Mayor Larson. All in favor?
Aye.
Did we need to find that it was not adverse to the public's safety and welfare?
I think that's implicit in the
Okay.
motion. Great.
She said grant.
Okay.
Yeah,
I just,
Nice job.
just making sure.
Okay. Third item is to consider a text amendment.
I do have a question for Mike.
Oh, okay, he's walking out the door. You better
Don't
get
walk
him.
out the door yet. How did it go with your 2 events in a row and the 4th of July? Are you gonna go for it next year? You have to come to the microphone though.
They were very successful. The 29th, the 3rd, and the 4th. Putting 2 events like that require a full setup and tear down back to back is a bit pressing with a pretty limited staff. But we had a lot of folks who invited friends or family in for the holiday. So I have so many fun stories to share of visitors to town for one or the other or both events, and gives me inspiration to try to do another one. The events are partially funded by a TGT grant, and in the grant request I say I'm going to do 2, and we're going to try to make 3 happen. But it definitely is. The number one question that I get after one of these events is when we're going to do another one, or when's the next one coming up. So it's exciting to be able to tell people about this next one.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, on to number 3, consider text amendment.
Good evening, Mayor, Commissioners, Sandy Day, Planning Office. This text amendment is brought to you predominantly at your direction. This text amendment is a result of analysis prepared by staff at your direction following the consideration of a rezoning request for property along Research Park Drive. You have in your packet background information that includes several definitions, as well as a map of where we have conditional zoning today, and some case examples of where we have used specifically conditional zoning. We want to go through what conditional zoning is and how we've used it, and also what conditional zoning is not. What it applies to in the context of what we're talking to tonight, it deals with base zoning districts. We do have types of zoning that we do apply conditions to. Those include special use permits, planned developments, overlay districts that inherently have conditions associated with them. That is not what we are talking about when we talk about conditional zoning. So we just want to make sure that as we talk about those things tonight, as we use the different terms, that we're very clear about what we're talking about as we have this discussion. Spot zoning, many times the public and others tend to use conditional zoning or spot zoning and some other terms interchangeably. They really are very different things, and we want to make sure that's very clear in this discussion. This is just one of those definitions. Some of this is in your packet, that spot zoning is very arbitrary. It is not necessarily following any type of goals or policies that we would find in our comprehensive plan. It is not consistent with what the surrounding zoning or land uses are for a particular area. We walked the Planning Commission through an example of a spot zoning. This is a very hypothetical case where a property owner would be asking to rezone a specific small parcel in the middle of a neighborhood. For instance, this example that we hypothetically created was where a property owner wanted to create a woodworking or cabinetry shop in that neighborhood. In this instance, they would need an IL or an industrial zone to be able to do what they want to do. That would be very obviously spot zoning. That would not be something that staff could recommend. That would not be something that we would recommend to the planning commissioner, that we would recommend that you support either. There would be no support in the comprehensive plan to do this type of zoning. As far as the legality of that there's unfair preference to an individual, it doesn't conform to any kind of land use plan, and that the overall interest of the general public is really not served in that kind of an example. How has conditional zoning been applied in Lawrence? This is a map that is in your packet. I did take the liberty of amending this map a little bit in this presentation. The small red circles highlight some very specific parcels that you see predominantly on the east side. You have a couple of case examples in your packets. Those were very specific properties. They were infill projects. Two of them were properties that were rezoned that restricted uses to be able to allow a project to go in, but also satisfied very specific neighborhood concerns. The types of conditions that have been applied to those various applications that we have seen, we have looked at restricting density. We have looked at restricting commercial retail square foot, restricting specific uses. In certain cases, projects have required a site plan to be brought to this body for approval, and that's requiring a more rigorous review or additional notice to the public for that project because there was additional neighborhood concern of that project, and the public wanted that additional notice of that project to be included in the overall review of the applications. So that test of conditional zoning is that those conditions are imposed to mitigate those impacts of what would otherwise be an appropriate land use. It conforms to the overall land use plan for that area, and it is found to be in the overall interest of the public health, safety, and welfare of that community. Planning Commission did have a very lively discussion about this tool that we use. That it is fairly flexible, and they appreciated the use of that it can be responsive to those considerations of the neighborhood. And you can read, and I'm sure you have read all of that discussion in the minutes. And then that it is flexible to infill development, and it's very transparent both for the applicant and for the commissions to respond to those particular applications. And I would also point out that in most of the applications where those uses are restricted, those are almost entirely the applicant has brought those use restrictions forward. They're not usually something that staff is proposing. We do have a discussion with them. Sometimes we'll talk with them about editing some of their use restrictions, but usually the applicant is coming forward with those use restrictions. They're wanting to be transparent. They're wanting to have a project that they can satisfy a known concern or issue to their neighbors. Some of the difficulties or challenges with conditional zoning can be some of the administrative pieces. How do we make applicants and property owners and interested parties knowledgeable of the conditions that are out there. We have a wonderful tool, our interactive mapping. You have an example of that map. With a click of a button now, you can go in and see that property is somehow highlighted. You can see exactly what that ordinance is, what those conditions are. If you do not have access to that technology, we are a phone call away, and we have a planner staffed to be able to answer those questions to the public, and we do get those questions, and we are able to answer them very easily. There is certainly that application that started this conversation where the applicant did propose to restrict everything out of that one particular request, which really started that discussion of how unusual it was to restrict everything out but that one particular use. Just to walk you quickly through some of those very specific examples that we saw in the map, some of the residential examples, Yankee Take Estates, Cedarwood, the Links, Fairfield Farms. These are all examples where residential density has been restricted down. What that means is that the residential zone was approved at a certain level. The zoning district allows a maximum density, but because the ordinance, the condition restricted that density below what could be developed. And that is consistent with policies we have in Horizon 2020. This is the policy that we find in Horizon 2020. The number of dwelling units per acre in any residential category should be reviewed as representing a potential range rather than a guaranteed maximum density. It should conform to what that surrounding area is, and through this conditional zoning, we are able to apply that and be specific and responsive to the unique conditions of a particular area. It's not something we do every time. We are very thoughtful about when it is recommended. This is an example of where that was used specifically for this project. It is along West 6th Street on the north side of the property. The base zoning is RM 24. The capped density is at RM 20. Maximum density is at 20 dwelling units per acre. And as you move further to the north, that density continues to graduate to a lower density. Some of those commercial examples where we have applied conditions are to some of those commercial caps, restricting commercial uses. Inverness Park, that was an extension that you saw on your consent agenda this evening, where that project required city commission approval. That is a conditional zoning that has been previously approved. Sunrise Garden, Jayhawk Bookstore, tenants to homeowners, those are all projects that were very sensitive in nature, required specific response of this body because of neighborhood concerns.
Can I ask you about the 1501 Leonard? Because as I recall, that project bared an eerie similarity to your hypothetical you presented 5 minutes ago that you said city staff would never support. And yet city staff did support it, and it passed on a 4-1 vote.
I think there were just some very unique characteristics and situations with that particular property.
Well, I think, if I may interject, I think the way the conditions were put forth versus the spot zoning that Sandy portrayed to be industrial uses amongst a sea of residential uses, these were uses that we felt compatible with the surrounding zoning and surrounding residential uses. But the conditional zoning tool gave us that ability to mold the zoning. Conditional zoning is akin to what a lot of cities have as PUDs, planned unit developments. The city of Lawrence had that model for many decades. And so that's how we have used it as a way to get very specific and context-based with all of these projects. And these are, not all the projects that we're showing you, but the ones that likely wouldn't exist today if not for the tool of conditional zoning.
But on a conditional zoning, it applies that zoning to the property in theory permanently, correct?
Yeah.
And regardless of change of usage. Whereas a special use permit or a conditional use permit would apply only to the individual actor on that property, right?
No, it all runs with the land, and one of the good things about conditional zoning from our perspective is it's a high hurdle to change. It has to go through the zoning process in order to change the zoning ordinance. So it has to go through the planning commission and through the city commission. So it's not something that we can do administratively, is alter a conditionally zoned property that you all have adopted through ordinance.
So this is an example of the Inverness Park properties where that condition grew out of the area plan, the neighborhood concern about how that property would be developed, the policies that were in that plan, and ultimately the site plan that was approved and the language that was in that plan, that it either be rezoned to have a planned development, or that if it be rezoned with conditions that the site plan come to the city commission for review. And that came back to that issue of having notice. And that was the ordinance number that approved that. It was in 2015. It was a site plan that has been approved, and as you saw, that it has been reestablished. One of the questions that came up at the Planning Commission was a discussion about a text amendment versus a conditional zoning. So that is a discussion that we do periodically have. An example of that, where we went through that process, was private dining. We had an issue back in 2010 where a property owner was operating essentially a restaurant out of their home. It was not a permitted use in that zoning district. It was a very unique type of a dining experience, and to be able to do that without rezoning the property, we went through a text amendment. We created something called private dining. It's a permitted use. It requires a special use permit. It has a set of standards that goes with it. It is the only property in Lawrence that has ever gone through that process, but it's a use that could be permitted in any residential zoning district with a special use permit. So it's a citywide application that it resulted out of that particular situation. Those are kind of the two pieces of that discussion. One of the questions that was asked of staff was, if we don't do this, what do we end up with? One of the discussion points was that we can either amend our code so many times to add so many uses to our different zoning districts to make our different zoning districts almost indistinguishable, or we can start creating so many zoning districts that, again, you start not having a lot of distinguishability between those zoning districts. So there is some weight there to how you want to approach these different things. There are two pieces of the code that would be amended if this is something the commission directs staff to go ahead and prepare the ordinance for. Article 13 has two pieces to it, 1301 and 1303, that both address how we have conditions. 1301 applies generally to all of the land, the development code, so there are some procedural language pieces that we would want to leave in place because they do affect how we handle special use permits, development plans. We would want to keep those pieces intact and just make that exception that we are not conditioning anything related to zoning changes in that text, and then to amend the appropriate text in 1303 as it applies to zoning map amendments. Ultimately, the Planning Commission's recommendation was to not make any changes to the text, and that is their recommendation to you, although they did anticipate there would be more discussion coming forward. I'm happy to try and answer any questions that you have about that discussion. Your options for this piece of it is to direct staff, if you would like to move forward with revising the text and creating an ordinance to change that and remove those options, to return the text amendment back to the Planning Commission for more discussion, or to accept the Planning Commission's recommendation and leave the text as it is for the time being.
Does the third option involve an action on our part, a motion?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have a pending text amendment in process that needs an action one way or the other.
So when, one of the concerns I have is in neighborhoods, how can a neighborhood predict? It's the predictability, and that's something I heard, a thread that I heard when I listened to the Planning Commission meeting, is that this really makes it to where it's not really predictable to neighborhoods. They live in a residential neighborhood, then all of a sudden you come in and do an IL on it. So how do you address that? And also the idea that, yeah, you may like the type of business that's there today based on that new zoning, but what's going to happen 20 years from now? Because my understanding is we should always plan for the future and not what, in fact, I think you say that quite a bit, Scott.
Yeah,
So,
it's the planning part of me. So Vice Mayor, those are good questions. I really think the predictability comes in the plans that conditional zoning seeks to implement. So most of these examples are generated by either a desire to meet a sector plan or a neighborhood plan or a policy of the comprehensive plan that it sort of gives us a finer scalpel in doing zoning than just the blunt instrument of zoning itself. So, because zoning goes up to certain categories of density and has a whole wide range of uses, sometimes you want a tool that fine-tunes an area or a project to the point where it's able to be compliant with a neighborhood plan or a sector plan. That's how we have used it, not to get out of the plan, but to conform to the plan. And so the predictability comes with those plans, and then this is just a way to implement it. The other way that it's used and generated is through the process and hearing issues brought up by neighbors. The former Jayhawk bookstore, the coffee shop, now the bakery, is such an example where out of that came the process condition. The neighbors really wanted the notice about future site plans that normally would be administrative. They wanted that to get to the governing body, and so that came with it a condition. That's why you saw it recently as a site plan approval, because it was an extra condition that we added to the zoning so that in the future, staff couldn't just ignore it, right? It was actually part of the zoning of that property. So those are the two ways we get it, and I would argue that it actually enhances predictability, or at least implements predictability. It doesn't produce predictability. That's the planning behind it, in my opinion.
Do we use conditional zoning to change the zoning designation of an area, or are we using it merely to restrict the zoning that already exists?
It's usually to rezone a property so the zones do distinguish uses, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there's a little bit of overlap in our different zones. And so some zones in a certain district may be compatible with other districts, but they're not designed that way now. Whereas other uses in that same zone may be completely incompatible. So we work with the applicant. The applicant, if they have a project that they think is compatible, doesn't want to bring with them the incompatible uses. So those are typically the uses that get struck out of the zoning ordinance and are not part of the request to rezone.
So when we have a large block of area that is zoned a certain way, and it's all uniformly zoned, are we finding that conditional zoning is being applied uniformly throughout that district, or is it being applied to a specific parcel but not to the rest of the district?
Typically, they are singular parcel projects. Can you think of, well, there are
So,
some residential.
where I'm going with this is
Okay.
the biggest difficulty I'm having, and you know, you had sent along definitions and I'd read through the packet, but the biggest difficulty I'm having is truly understanding an actual difference between spot zoning and what we're calling conditional zoning. I understand that there's a textbook difference between them, but just as soon as we read that textbook difference, you provide examples that I would dub spot zoning. And it seems to me that we're only calling it conditional to allow us to be able to do it.
I think if you studied each one, I think your best argument for that, Commissioner, is Sunrise Gardens, because I can
Because
see,
it's an
I can see that
industrial
perspective.
project in the middle of a
'Cause it's
residential
industrial and
neighborhood.
residential. I would argue that the vast majority of the other examples aren't that stark of a contrast, that they are either like Jayhawk Club, the residential use that's capped with density. They're commercial density caps in commercial nodes that are already going to be commercial in some component. There's a few that maybe IL and an IG area. So I see the perspective on the Sunrise Gardens project. I would argue the rest of those are not that stark of a comparison.
So how do we protect against Sunrise Garden?
Well,
type? I mean,
because these projects
that went
come-
through the process, quote unquote, but it was a 4-1 vote at this table.
It's 3-2.
3-2 vote at this table.
That's the protection. It's the city commission consideration and approval or denial of a request.
Okay.
Commissioner Randy Larkin with the City Attorney's Office. Sunrise Garden wasn't necessarily spot zoning, even though it went to IL, mainly because there was it wasn't incompatible with the neighbors, wasn't deleterious to their properties, and didn't reduce property values. Typically what happens when you have a spot zoning, what makes it illegal, is kind of a due process issue, is, for example, in a residential area, you'll rezone maybe one lot to a duplex or an apartment complex, so that that person can use their property to their benefit to the detriment of their neighbors. And I don't believe that we got to that point. Because of the conditional zoning, we're able to make it compatible and make it fit in, and it wouldn't harm the neighbors.
Though
to the
in less
benefit
than
of
one calendar year, we had a case come before the city commission of neighbors that were claiming harm as a direct result of the industrial usage at the property, right?
It was the fires.
Who defines detriment to property?
Excuse me?
Who defines detriment to property?
You
To
do.
surrounding property?
I mean, that's the decision that has to be made by the city commission when they're looking at the application. I mean, staff will make a recommendation, planning commission will look at it, make a recommendation, but then that has to be ultimately decided by the city commission.
Because I have to admit, I'm along the line with Commissioner Herbert, is I don't quite get the difference between spot and.
We've had many discussions, because they come to me with these sometimes ahead of time before they go to the planning commission. I'll look at it. Sometimes I'll say, that borders on spot zoning. I'm not very comfortable with that. Sometimes they'll come and I say, yeah, that looks to me like it's okay. I don't have a problem with it. The difference between conditional zoning is basically you're putting a zoning on it, and it's to help, like I said, the neighbors, help make the uses compatible, so that it's not a deleterious use to the neighbors. You get these in boarding properties a lot of times, and whereas spot zoning is something that's incompatible with the land use plan, incompatible with the neighboring properties, and usually is done to the benefit of that owner to the detriment of everybody else. So that's kind of the touchstone that we look at in those types of situations.
The Leonard project, the Sunrise project, they took that, made an industrial zoning, stripped off all the uses, if I remember right, and then they added back in a couple of uses, is that right? And then the only way they could do those uses, or if they wanted to do some of those uses, they'd have to come back for a special use permit.
Correct.
So doesn't that seem like there's some legal issues there that we are denying somebody use? You're saying they can't use it for all the industrial uses, but they can if they come back and ask for a special permit.
No, they'd have to get it rezoned.
No, a special permit, actually.
Well, there are certain uses in all of our districts that are allowed by right and then require a special use permit. So we don't make up the special use permit process. It was already a special use permit in that IL zoning district. So the alternative, running with Sunrise Gardens as an example, is keeping it a residential zoned property and then doing a text amendment to add some of the industrial uses. What we're trying to point out is that that's a citywide application then, and then those industrial type uses go to any RS area in the city if you do it the text amendment route. So both zoning tools have consequences, but we find overall that conditional zoning has been a worthwhile tool.
Yeah, we've had, I mean, on here, I went down and counted them because the 10 years I was involved with the East Lawrence Neighborhood Association, 5 of those are when I was involved with them, and we used it to great success. You know, you have on here Decade Cafe, I think the Cider Gallery might have been one too. So I really like the use of it. You know, I understand, I guess, a little more since we were smack in the middle of it for so long, is that we didn't want to rezone the whole area. You know, we just wanted to allow certain uses without a grand rezoning of it to, because like he was talking about, that kind of border areas where it becomes difficult. Of course, Pennsylvania would be one of those border stretches. And so if we weren't using conditional zoning, you know, we would definitely have, I think, something, nothing at all, or something much more dramatic, which would have potentially been detrimental, which is, I guess, the word we're using. Of course, KT, I don't know if you have it memorized, but whenever we were using conditional zoning and looking at it, she has like memorized a list of things that we restrict, like fast food drive-throughs, furriers, that's always my favorite one that you would mention, payday loans. She has like her nice list that always gets added, say, we don't allow these uses though. So we found it really helpful, I thought.
I have a question about subsequent owners. And the projects I think about are like Sunrise and the kind of industrial facility there, and it's got IL zoning on it. And I don't think the city did it right.
Yeah, I
I'll
voted
sue
against
them.
that. I remember that.
To get the IL aspects of that. And,
It's temporary.
and so my question is, have you seen a judge say, yeah, it's okay to do that? Do you have a case where they said, essentially what we did is we stripped out everything that was IL except for one thing?
There are some cases involving special use permits. They've also oftentimes used the same rules applied between zoning and special use permits where certain conditions have been allowed. There is no case in Kansas involving a rezoning per se.
Okay, so we don't actually have case law on that specific thing that we did.
Right. There are cases where there's a lot of authority that says conditional zoning is legal. Certain aspects of contract zoning are not legal, which is a different animal yet. It's kind of a corollary, but a different animal. And spot zoning is illegal, but conditional zoning is not illegal, just there's no Kansas case on it.
Why is
Not
that?
illegal.
Why is there a Kansas case law?
Excuse me?
Is it new? Is it new concept? We hadn't been around long enough
I
to
don't
be
know that
tried in the
anyone's ever
courts?
thought that it was a big problem. I don't know if
Okay.
there's been any cases
Yeah.
and no one
Okay.
sued over it.
How long
If we
have
were
we-
to be sued over a case like that, something from 20 years ago, it would be barred by the statute of limitations or statute of repose. There's 30 days once the ordinance is passed to sue on a rezoning.
Okay.
My concern, and you asked about case laws, isn't Kansas certainly, so it doesn't apply to us, but North Carolina Court of Appeals, they had a case, Decker versus Coleman, that involved, and this is why I asked if we were rezoning or if we were putting conditions upon already zoned land. And in this case, they were taking it from residential to commercial, but a particular parcel they did conditional zoning on and required, I think it was like a 62-foot buffer zone. And the North Carolina Court of Appeals, their statement was, when conditions are used as a condition of rezoning and are not uniformly applied throughout a zoning district, they violate the law. So that's North Carolina, that's not Kansas. But I have some concern, given that there are dozens of examples, well, maybe not dozens, that's an exaggeration. There are examples where we are doing just that. And that's of concern.
I want to go back to Randy's response, if I could, real
Yeah.
quick. and that is, if somebody buys that property 20 years from now,
Yes.
how does the statute affect them?
They
The
have-
statute of limitations?
It would be, in effect, you have 30 days from once an ordinance is passed to challenge that ordinance.
Okay,
If it's not challenged by anybody, then the ordinance is in place. 20 years down the road, I mean, you have 10-year statute of repose from the time that something happens of that nature. There just wouldn't be any avenue to bring in action for that.
Okay.
They would be bound by the ordinance.
okay, thank you.
So, the one thing that I think the least that we need to look at doing, or I'd like to look at doing, is to have a discussion about putting some sort of process or parameters on conditional zoning, because it just seems like it's whatever's out there, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. So it just seems to me like it would be good to have that conversation, or at least have staff look at that.
We could. It would be a challenge because they're so context-based that it's hard to predict what a framework would help with the neighbor issues or with meeting a plan, neighborhood plan or sector plan. But if you gave us a little more direction on what framework you're looking at, we could study it a little more.
Do we have any guiding principles on conditional zoning?
We have golden criteria by which we judge zoning requests.
Okay.
And so we do use those: compatibility, the use, what the plan says, the impact to neighbors, those sorts of criteria. That's the test we use on any rezoning request.
Would that be something that would go back to the planning commission for an in-depth discussion?
It could. I might also note that before this 2006 code, through the former process, it wasn't uncommon at all to see use categories with any number of uses stricken from the code. So the Lawrence has a decade's worth of history in using these tools to get very context sensitive with a project in a site. Yeah, the plan developments a lot of cities use this type of method to talk about inconsistent setbacks and landscape requirements, and they basically write little mini zoning codes with every project they come through. We don't want to do that. We don't advocate for that. We think it's consistent within the zoning districts that we're working within. That's kind of the applicability across the board part. But yeah, we could go back and have this discussion.
Do we have vulnerabilities for some neighborhoods that don't have plans?
Well, we have the process, which is the greatest protection, because we have the notice, we have the participation of the neighbors, we have the input to the planning commission and governing body. And one of the things we talked about at planning commission that we were a bit challenged with is trying to figure out exactly what harm we were trying to solve here, what issues. And so some of this discussion is good. If we could get maybe more about what the issues are that we need the code to solve, we could go back to the planning commission and focus in on those issues.
I guess I'll chime in there and tell you what I see as the problem is to the vice mayor's point is I don't see this as a very predictable tool. And I mean, I understand you have a professional response to that, and I appreciate that. But to me, I'm always going to advocate for that notion of a level playing field. And when we have two properties that are zoned the same, but they're not, the code per se isn't uniformly applied to both, that concerns me. And it concerns me from a residential standpoint when we talk about infill development, and yet we have different areas that residential allows for one level and another differently. What I would ask is, generally speaking, have you seen conditional use be used to increase or decrease density within neighborhoods?
It's usually always decreasing,
Right.
because what you have is the zoning district gives you maximums, but the plan may have you down here, and so we use that to comply with the plan. And so if we take that tool away from us, you'll likely still get the request for the most density, and then your predictability kind of gets diminished a little bit, because you might have one project in front of you this year. Once it's zoned, that goes away, and now you've got somebody who has figured out how to go to the maximum density, and it would be zoned appropriately for that. So it's almost always decreasing the density. Or it's matching the plan, is how I would put it.
I want to go back to a little bit just to the neighborhood plans, area plans, nodal plans. Because I thought I heard you say that the process is really the best protector. But don't the area and neighborhood plans even provide a higher level of protection?
Well, I think that's,
Beyond?
we use those plans in the process to bring that information to the planning commission and governing body to say, look, this plan has this pattern. Sometimes it's development pattern, sometimes it's a structure type versus density, sometimes it's use, sometimes it's the density.
Because I think that's been used in the past to actually act as a protection for these conditional zoning issues in some of the examples that you provided.
It's only a protection as far as the governing body wants it to be in their decision-making of
Right.
any kind of.
So if
That's what we've
so if a
witnessed.
neighborhood does not have a plan, then they've lost that potential level of protection, or they don't have it, not that they lost it,
They
just
don't have it, they fall back to the comprehensive plan policies.
So should we, at some point in time, make sure all neighborhoods have a plan, or is that a whole nother?
That's a different discussion perhaps. We find the neighborhood plans very helpful as guides. They're very specific to what neighborhoods desire. We have several of them, as you know. We have some that are in need of update. We have other priorities in our work plan
Yeah.
throughout the years, but yeah, we'd like to get to the point where we have more neighborhood plans and more updated neighborhood plans.
Okay.
Sometimes the ones that need it the most are the ones that don't have it.
Don't have it,
That's
yeah.
true.
Right.
So in East Lawrence, we have a plan. 8th and Penn has their own plan as well. We have historic districts on top of that, and then we have city commissioners that overrule things. We've had that happen to us too, quite a bit. So it's nice to think that neighborhood plans have as much authority as they do, but they don't. So be careful how you assume that. And I mean, the Oriat is a really good example as well, because they have a plan, but they felt it was being overruled so much by commissioners that they wanted an overlay plan on top of that. And I think they also have a historic district. So when he says the governing body can overrule whatever they want, they can and they do. So that's what I find really interesting, is that you all are interested in removing conditional zoning, but frankly, conditional zoning gives commissioners and the neighborhood flexibility for compromise and would actually tie the hands of future commissioners, which you guys talk a lot about not wanting to do.
I just think there needs to be a little bit more guidelines on how it's used, more process.
The process does
Yeah.
it. You should come through some of our processes in the past. They were painful. They were
I guess I haven't been here for 2 years. Yeah, I've been here.
They were not pleasant.
If I may interject, and I see our vice chair of the planning commission in the audience who may or may not speak, but I wanted to piggyback on something Sandy talked about, which is that the planning commission talked at the end of their discussion when they agreed that it was a tool that they thought worthy of maintaining in the code, that they would like to see this discussion further, that even their decision wasn't the end of the discussion. They wanted to see it in the context of the new comprehensive plan that's also coming, and saw that. So I'm forecasting that it will be a future work plan item for us as that comprehensive plan comes online and we get back into the regulations that implement the comp plan.
Public comment.
Well, if we're finished asking questions. Okay, public comment.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, Vice Mayor, Commissioners. My name is Ted Boyle, North Lawrence Improvement. We do have a neighborhood plan. It is what you might call an older one, but we think it's efficient. And, you know, I think this rezoning thing, probably the older neighborhoods, as North Lawrence, we've got a lot of business intertwined with residential. I mean, that's just the way North Lawrence is. And, I mean, we don't look for new businesses to bulldoze down a bunch of houses and put something like that there. But the existing properties that are there, the commercial properties, a good example is 401 Elm that we talked about last year and had condemned, and the owner came back and rebuilt it. It was an 1880 grocery store, and you know, it's back. It had a woodworking shop in it, and we helped the owner get that established again with conditional uses, and the neighbors agreed to that. So that's how I think zoning should work. Is your neighborhood, your resident participation, and have input on it, and existing businesses and buildings that were built 100 years ago and that are still being businesses, like down Locust Street, for instance, the residents on the back side, the 500 block Oak Locust, there's a new business going in down there, and the first thing I told them was go around and talk to all your residents behind you and talk to them and tell them what you're going to do and ask them for input. And of course, I had a meeting I had to get a zoning variance for them on the parking, and I'll tell you what, it was 100% participation from the residents in that area agreeing on that business being there. So you know, older neighborhoods, we are what we are, you know what I mean? And North Lawrence is pretty unique because we got a floodplain, you know what I mean? Everything is managed by the floodplain and the stormwater. So, but to change the zoning, I think we need this tool as it is. So, thank you.
Thanks, Ted.
Hello, KT Walsh again. I concur with what Ted just said, and Commissioner Soden has already said how valuable this tool has been for East Lawrence over the years. I just wanted to clarify, Commissioner Herbert, I can't remember how you said it, but you said something to the effect of, doesn't it always restrict the use, or, oh, I can't even remember.
Increase the density.
I was asking
Thank
if
you,
generally
yeah.
it's used to increase or decrease density.
Yeah, and there were two examples among the 5 in East Lawrence. One was 1245 Connecticut. A family wanted to open a funeral parlor, and at that point, payday and title loans were just mushrooming all over the city, and we knew they were heading our way. And so we wanted that restricted, so should the funeral home go out, we couldn't get a payday or title loan in there because they're predatory and they hurt poor people. And so we were able to do that. The other one was down at the end of East 9th Street when they rezoned to be able to have a coffee shop, not Decade, but further on in the metal buildings. And it also, the zoning would have allowed fast food. And so we said, yes, coffee shop drive-through, but not full fast food drive-through. So that was the only restriction right there. So sometimes it's just kind of small stuff, but it really helps. I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Thanks, KT.
Good evening. My name is Michael Allman. I live in Brook Creek neighborhood, and speaking for myself tonight. I certainly do appreciate your concerns about protection of our neighborhoods. Living in an older neighborhood as some of these other people, we seem to oftentimes be the target of what we think of as assault. People, you know, developers looking for opportunities, cheap land or whatever. But I do have to say that neighborhood plans are not a protection. they're not part of the code. They're not part of the zoning or any part of the code. They're part of the comprehensive plan. So they're a guide. What are protections would be the overlay districts, which are part of the zoning code. So that you have to make sure you understand the difference there. For protections, the thing about conditional zoning, as I see it, which is part of the code, is that it's oftentimes, most often, as far as I can tell, a historical anomaly area, something that has existed out of sync with its context for one reason or another, like industrial zoning in the middle of a residential neighborhood. Those are the situations where most often this seems to come forth. And I find it not so much a tool of predictability, which it's not. It's a tool of negotiability. It's where somebody wants to make some creative, readaptive use of this historical anomaly, and the neighbors are saying, wait a minute, this is our residential neighborhood. What do you have in mind? You know, it's an industrial zone. Well, then you start talking. And this is the tool that allows that conversation, from my perspective. When I first heard of this, I think it was in 2008 or 10, I don't know, whenever the Salvation Army issue came up in Brook Creek neighborhood on Haskell and Lynn. Industrial zone, shouldn't have been industrial. It's a light commercial area, just historically never reverted. So they were making use of the industrial zoning. They wanted to do a drop-in homeless shelter. We said, wait a minute, not drop-in. I mean, we don't mind you having a shelter if it's like families or, you know, overnight, but not drop-in, not a food kitchen, you know, soup kitchen. So conditions were placed on it to reach that compromise level. The whole process, the whole project never materialized, but if it did, it would be much more acceptable. Same with struct-restruct. It was historically industrial use, residential zoning, but it was illegal industrial. The compromise we reached, some of the property is residential now, very nicely.
Thanks,
and
Michael.
conditional on the commercial use. So it's a way to reach that compromise. So I support it.
Other public comment?
Jim Carpenter. I'm here as an individual, not planning commissioner. But Commissioner Herbert, well, all but Commissioner Ananda will know that I was the one person that showed up to object to the use of conditional zoning for the 15th and Leonard for some of the issues that were discussed tonight. And it does strike me, as it does you, that that is very close to what spot zoning was. That caused a concern, and for me to start talking about the need for more predictability in our code. Right now, the justification for conditional zoning that I found back then, my first experience with it, was that it's just picking out phrases from the existing development code and saying that we can do this. And primarily relying on the case law that says you can do conditional use permits in the county and special use permits in the city, but there's nothing specifically testing the use of this conditional zoning the way it's been used. Now I have to give a little bit more, because now being on the planning commission, I've had the opportunity to see the staff report that's before you tonight as part of the packet, which lists 32 different times that this was used. And my position has changed slightly, because when I was first came into this, they were both basically, for lack of a better term, upzoning from residential to light industrial, or in the example of the mini warehouse one that you just voted a text amendment to rectify that this evening, which upzoned and then struck all additional new uses to just get those few that you wanted. Now the one at 15th Leonard really stood out to me, because in addition to that, uses permitted by right now required special use permits. and that just seemed a little bit beyond the pale. So I think that's kind of the anomaly and outlier. Others that Commissioner Soden worked on, like Decade Coffee, you can go back and look at that record and see letters from the neighborhood, please don't include these uses, and those are generally down zonings. They were from general industrial to light industrial. That's what Decade Coffee was. That's what Silverback on 19th Street is, which was Zimmerman Steel, went from industrial to light industrial for the activities they wanted there. Those were different. The very first ones that were in the packet were about the links, and that was going from agricultural land, bringing new land into the city, and wanting to play with the density patterns. They maintain additional open space and the development pattern they were talking about. Now I can see there's value in all of those. The ones that I really am having problems with were the upzoning. So, and just the 401 Elm that was mentioned, that was actually resolved by a text amendment and not conditional zoning.
Thanks, Jim. Any questions for Jim? Okay, thanks. Other public comment? Okay, we'll bring it back to the commission. We're considering a text amendment. Could you give us the slide that shows us our choices for action this evening, please?
I'm in favor of the third one.
This issue's been really difficult for me. I've spent a lot of time going back and forth on this one. For me, the reason why this issue is really difficult is it comes down to making a decision over what I value more. What I see is the philosophical, version of what government should be versus the actual day-to-day reality of what it is. And I think Michael Allman actually said it very well when he said that this is about negotiability, not predictability. So kind of philosophically, ideologically, what I see a planning department's role being is predictability. It is about planning, and planning to me means long-term. It means more than just 2 steps in front of your nose. The reality of day-to-day operations of a government is, though, that every day you're presented with a request for this, that, or the other, and it requires negotiability. And so the difficulty for me is trying to decide if we make an action today to promote predictability, long-range planning, which I think, I personally believe, in terms of long-range planning, conditional zoning, which sometimes rolls, in my opinion, into spot zoning, I think doesn't do a very good job of. But from day-to-day operation, I think conditional zoning allows you to be more user-friendly, if that makes sense. It allows you to work with an individual applicant to a greater degree. It allows our city government to be more open to those conversations as opposed to that rigid bureaucratic wall that people oftentimes perceive government to be. When you just say, sorry, the zoning is this, please go away, that's kind of rigid bureaucratic wall. But it is predictable because it is rigid. And so this is one of the, to be perfectly honest with you, one of the tougher votes I've had in months in the commission, because I can absolutely see it both ways. And I guess either way I vote, I'm wrong, so.
Well, for me, I appreciate that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, because we know that our neighborhoods' needs are never one-size-fits-all. That's why we have so many diverse and unique neighborhoods within this community. I'm also not, I don't operate from a place of fear of litigation. We can be sued for anything at any time. We could be sued for this meeting tonight for the words that I'm saying right now. And so it's going to occur no matter what. I think that not having case law is not a reason to not do something. That was a triple negative. So I'm sorry if you got lost in that.
That's impressive, actually.
I was counting that.
So, if this is something for which we do experience litigation, then we change our behavior, we change our ordinances, we change the policy. The recommendation from the city attorney's office, who's assuredly probably reviewed this, as well as the planning department, is to move forward with this. I trust our staff. I trust them to not put us at risk. And I'm not hearing anything that's waving a red flag for me that our decisions could be found arbitrary and capricious. These are things that take a lot of meeting time to discuss and consider, and we listen to a lot of public comment on these issues, and we consider all of those opinions. So I'm not seeing anything based on the case law that we have been presented with that is an obvious risk at this time. I think that neighborhood plans are important and part of our consideration. Our job as commissioners is to plan for the present and the future. So those neighborhood plans are definitely a consideration, but sometimes we do have to consider outside of them when we are looking further into the future than where neighborhoods might be at the moment. I think it's really good to have guidelines or considerations in regard to how we move forward on conditional zoning issues. I think that I would be opposed to creating more process because this is really our responsibility to not make this spot zoning. It's our decision-making process, and our decisions that we make are what keep us from having spot zoning. So it's determined on the back end whether or not it's spot zoning, in my understanding, or conditional zoning based on the way that the decision was made and the considerations that we used in making that decision. So that onus is on us. So I think that if we're using sound leadership, if we're using good decision-making skills, and we're relying on our residents to make good voting decisions for folks who are going to make the kinds of decisions that they can support in those neighborhoods and to make those reasonable decisions that wouldn't become spot zoning, then that's how the system is supposed to work. So I do support the recommendation to deny.
So we know number one's off the table then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Well, I'm interested in sending it back to the planning commission to have further discussion, because I do think that neighborhoods deserves a level of predictability in the zoning, that, you know, when they buy their house in a neighborhood, that there's going to be a residential area. That's the way it's zoned, and if it changes, then I just think there needs to be some more guidelines. I'm not asking for rules, ordinances, or laws, but I do think there needs to be a little bit more guidelines. So I'm in favor of number 2.
Well, I appreciate your courage in not fearing lawsuits, Commissioner Anand. It may come from your background as an attorney, where my experience as an accountant is that I fear lawsuits because the cost of litigation can be really steep. And I'm all in favor of paying attorneys if you absolutely have to, but if you can avoid it, I'd rather not. So I'm really interested in a further conversation. I'm not sure how to make that happen. I'm reluctant to essentially go against the recommendation of the staff and the planning commission on this one. I am favor number 3 up there. But saying that, I think we need to continue the conversation, and I'm curious how that would roll out with the Horizon 2040. And so that's kind of what I'm interested in, is, you know, keeping the conversation going about how this is working and how it will work for our community.
And just to interject, I think we can, you know, the planning commission does mid-month meetings as well as their regular meeting.
Yeah.
We can clearly keep the conversation going with them as well
Yeah.
during those.
Well, from watching the tape, it seemed like they were interested in this conversation
They were.
going forward as well. And that's what I'd like to encourage them to do. I don't want to send it back and say, come up with other text, but, you know, this conversation will be an important one for our community.
Yeah, that would be my difficulty with sending it back, is I don't frankly know what we would say to them.
Yeah.
Right? And we dealt with this last week when we talked about the Cultural Arts Commission. Well, if you send it back, what do you tell them to do differently than they did the first time around? If we send this back to the planning commission without enough votes to remove conditional zoning, essentially what we're saying is we don't have the votes to remove conditional zoning, but we're not willing to accept your statement that we shouldn't remove conditional zoning. I mean, I would have no idea how to direct them. And so to me, when I look at the options, if we don't have the votes for one, which we don't, I think you have to jump down to 3.
So, any other conversation?
So does that, on voting number 3, but they're gonna still have a conversation, is that what I'm
Right,
understanding? We're gonna still let it go back to them for a further conversation, is that what I'm understanding?
We'll take that direction, yes,
Okay, so it's not a dead issue,
correct.
okay, I'm fine with that.
So I'd entertain a motion.
Well, I would add to the conversation then that, one thing with the older neighborhoods and why they deal with this a lot is because they were founded more on mixed use. And so, but getting that right, mixed use, is difficult. So, I understand that, I mean, we're gonna vote on the third one and I'm glad for that. But in the conversation that they have, I just want to be careful that that's not disregarded, you know, is that we need to make only residential, only industrial, only commercial, that mixed use is still, you know, something that's vibrant for our community and that we like. I just want to add that.
And I would encourage you to include in your motion the direction to keep the conversation going.
Yeah, I think that would be good. I mean, I don't disagree with you, Leslie. I mean, we're looking right now at infill being extremely important for sustainability. So I'm fine with that.
Well, I'd make a motion then, if we're done discussing. I would move that my motion would be that we accept the recommendation of the Planning Commission and thereby vote to retain the existing code language, maintaining conditional zoning in the Land Development Code, but with direction to the Planning Commission to continue the conversation about appropriate uses of conditional use.
Conditional zoning.
Conditional zoning, thank you.
Does that capture it for you, Scott?
Yes, sir.
Second.
We have a motion from Commissioner Herbert, second from Commissioner Ananda. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. I think that's unanimous. Let's take about a 5-minute break.
gavel her up here.
We're on to number 4 here. Consider authorizing publication of the 2018 amended budget summary and establishing August 7, 2018 as the public hearing date. Brian?
Good evening, Brian Kedney, Finance Director. We have 2 items before you this evening. The first one is setting public hearing for the 2018 revised budget, and then the second one is for the 2019 revised budget. And tonight we would ask that you just take a look at the expenditures as proposed. These reflect the meetings coming from, I think, beginning at the May 5th city manager presentation. There's been adjustments. Since that time, we've covered the adjustments at multiple commission meetings. Tonight's purpose is to base the a public hearing on the maximum expenditures for the 2018 revised budget and set August 7th at 5:45 p.m. as the date and time for the public hearing for that budget.
Questions for Brian?
I did have a question. I just wanted to make sure I was understanding things correctly. So the about $2.5 million that is being transferred to capital improvement reserve fund for 2018, not 2019, right?
Correct.
Okay. I've got that flipped around in my head. And so then, the $200,000 for rental vouchers, that's going into 2018.
So the current proposed budget, revised budget, the total authorized expenditures, the transfer is included in the general fund transfer out. When we presented this last week, this showed $603,000 of spending money out of the housing trust fund. As you can see, the notice of public hearing is currently $803,000.
Okay.
Again, I want to remind the commission that doesn't mean that having the public hearing notice going out doesn't necessarily mean now it is going to be $803,000. That decision's made after the public hearing. You first have to have a public hearing to discuss it, and then the decision would be made, and then an ordinance then would be proposed to actually give you that additional spending authority. However, between now and the public hearing, you would not be able to increase it more than what's on this notice, but you would be able to reduce it.
I just want to make sure I had it correctly. Since we're doing them at the same time, it's hard to keep them straight sometimes. 18 here, 19 here. Thank you.
Other questions for Brian?
So that 200,000 piece that we talked about at the last meeting regarding the wintering is reflected in the 8 there adjustment in the
Yes.
housing trust? Okay, and
Yes.
so having it in the housing trust rather than say the general fund precludes us from using it for anything outside of the housing trust?
Well, again, the expenditure, the $803,000 reflects the maximum expenditure that you can have in the housing fund. If the governing body subsequently came back and said we would only spend $603,000 as was originally proposed, that doesn't mean you would have to spend the $803,000. On top of that, in the general fund, that transfer would be the same regardless if it went into the housing fund or what was originally proposed going into the capital reserve fund. So that doesn't propose that you wouldn't, if you decided not to spend it out of the housing fund, that $200,000, you would still have the budget authority in the capital reserve fund or in the general fund, because all 3 of these funds would have budget authority in order to spend that.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Brian? Okay, and so we're talking about authorizing publication of the 2018 amended budget summary and establishing August 7th as the public hearing date. Right. I was just saying what
Sorry.
public comment was going to be on, and I appreciate the reminder, Sherry. So we'll move to public comment on this issue of the 2018 amended budget summary. Okay, let's bring it back to the commission.
Well, I'll move that we authorize publication of the 2018 amended budget summary and establish August 7th, 2018 as the public hearing date.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any further conversation up here? The motion is from Commissioner Soden, second is Commissioner Ananda. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Number 5 is similar but different.
I apologize. It really wouldn't all fit on here and people still be able to hear or be able to see. Specifically, I just wanted to point out, first of all, the date, August 7th, it's the same evening as the 2018 revised. It does set the maximum expenditures of all the legally required budgets. It also sets the maximum property tax that would be able to be raised once this hearing is, or once this is published. This also has the current estimated mill levy that would be based on the current the current estimated market value, estimated assessed value. And the city manager had asked earlier, but I just want to mention that each mill is roughly $1,040,000. I have highlighted here the Housing Trust Fund. When this was put in the packet, it was at the $603,000 because we literally hadn't done that, what you just did this previous time. When this goes out to the paper and be published, this will show $803,000. That was reflected on the motion you just made.
I have a question. I was talking to some people in the audience at the break, and if 19th Street is being moved to 2021 somehow, that we still have design and land acquisition in a budget for next year. I know that they're wanting to get more answers on why that part is still in the budget if the whole project is being moved 2 years.
I'll attempt to answer that, but obviously if I get too much into engineering things, you don't want an accountant talking about engineering. But what had happened, the CIP now shows it being moved out a year or two. We do know both the public works on the street side and the utilities on the water line side, especially the utility on water line, really believes that the infrastructure is going to fail soon or within the next couple of years, whether or not it's just crumbling of the street or water line in there. So staff believes that this will happen. This repair of this road or the reconstruction of this road will happen. And so in order to be prepared for it, we did keep that much in the budget for engineering design. And then also I believe there's $25,000 in there for land acquisition also.
I know that they're worried about the scope of the design. Is this the time and place that we would talk about the scope, or is this something that we would talk about next week or next meeting, I should say? Or
again, I think that actually would be when it's in the operating budget for the next fiscal year. Currently, it's in the plan to be done in 2021 now based on the CIP. And so it might be premature, but I would turn that over to the Public Works or City Manager on whether or not this is premature to do the design.
to talk about the scope?
Or to talk about the scope.
So
of the
when you
street
talk
design.
about scope, you're talking about the specific design.
I believe so. I know we don't have public comment yet, but I'm summarizing what.
Our plan would be, like Brian mentioned, the reason why we need to have the plans designed for the full thing is the water line's going to need to be replaced. They've had several breaks on it. It's going to blow out, and then they're not going to be able to have anything to tie back onto. So the water line has to be replaced. if we have any intention at any time in the future of putting a road in, we need to know what that grade, that final grade of that road's gonna be. Because we don't wanna put the water line in and then find out we need to cut the grade and the water line is a foot below ground. On the other side, when we go underneath the ditch area, the creek area, we know we're gonna have to replace that structure there, that RCB. We don't want the road grade to come up and the water line be 10 foot underground. So we wanna try and keep it at 4 to 5 feet, so that we can maintain it, fairly reasonably. So that's why we wanna do the plan. So when we do the plan, we will have the full neighborhood, meetings and input on scope and everything else, to get the design to what a commission would want to do whenever they desire to build it. And at this point, we've got it 2021 for construction. So it will be just like any of our other projects. We'll sit down with the neighbors, you know, that whole group along 19th Street, I'm assuming, and we will go through and, you know, we'll look at, I think the mayor mentioned, I can't remember if it's a bicycle track or at least separated bicycle facilities. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about the road. We'll talk, you know, 2 lanes, 3 lanes, roundabouts at Harper, signalization, what, you know, the gamut, but we'll go over the design at that point.
Okay, thank
Okay.
you.
Any other questions for Brian?
Do we need to talk about, you know, we received today an email from Officer Fennelly that was talking about publishing a maximum mill levy in the midst of police MOU discussions. What impact does that potentially have on budget implications?
Well, I do know, you know, I have not personally been in the MOU discussions. However, I do know that they are still in discussions. And the matching the expenditure to something we don't know specifically yet may be a little problematic. But I will say, just like we are this year with revising the 2018 budget, which we've done the last 2 years, I would anticipate if there's something that really is materially or that would impact the budget based on the negotiations, we would have the opportunity to go back and revise and either go into fund balance or find some other project that we would have to cut.
So in your opinion, it would not affect the maximum budget authority?
No, I don't believe so in this case.
Okay.
Keep in mind that on the state budget authority, we are also including the fund balance as the expenditure. I would not anticipate that would be a concern at all. That
Okay.
we would.
How long have we been doing that, Brian? Including the fund balance and the expenditure?
You know, I think the current forms were set up in the 40s or something, so I think that's.
I don't think they used to include the fund balance here in Lawrence, did they?
Yeah, absolutely.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, either by fund, oh, you didn't? Oh, okay.
We used to budget a transfer that we didn't intend to make, and that
Okay.
was our fund balance.
Okay. Okay.
You're both right. It was in the,
Okay.
it was in the expenditures, but it was
It
reflected
was,
differently.
it was labeled as
So
an.
I
not-
didn't understand that. So go ahead.
To expand on the question from Commissioner Herbert, the budget does include adjustments for merit steps. That amounts to $121,200. There's also possible competencies. Competencies are add pays for accumulation of additional skill sets that are recognized by the MOU. The budget includes $63,000 for those. Every percent currently is estimated at about $107,000. So if you were going to, using their range of what they claim is comparable in peer cities, 5.5%, you'd have to add $588,500 to this document. If you were to go at the 3%, which they requested, you'd be at $321,000. when we initiated our process for MOU discussions, we wanted a pay plan that was competitive. We wanted internal comparisons, and quite frankly, this is the first MOU that I've been involved in since I've been here. But if you look at internal comparisons with other employees, we have, I think, created, or on the path to create, some inequitable arguments. Okay, I'm not going to agree that they're inequitable yet, but I think that's that internal equity issue that you have to pay attention to. And I think the other thing is that our other prong, the three prongs, were management rights. And so the management rights section of the resolution, which authorizes you to negotiate, spells out very specifically what management rights are. So those were our three issues in that negotiation. And so there's going to have to be some level of balance, which there usually is in all negotiations. But the process now has moved to mediation. And after mediation, if that is not successful, it comes to this commission. And the commission ends up making decisions on which offer, final best offer, you're gonna take, and you take the whole package of whatever that is. So there's still some process left in this negotiation. You heard Brian's explanation, so you can, you end up maybe transferring from fund balance. The other option is you determine that you're gonna cut other expenses and use those funds to fund whatever market merit adjustment you use. So the decisions aren't without pain. You're gonna have to evaluate those things and then make that decision.
Another option would be to raise the mill levy, publishing it tonight.
That's correct.
So
Wish
it
to
would
do
be
that.
about 0.3 or 0.5 of a mill for the two.
Yeah, it would be over a half mil at the upper
Okay.
end, but to be, I mean, I don't quite understand why they included that number, except to maybe help justify the lower number. But yeah, the other part would be about a 0.3.
But if we wanted to raise the mill levy, tonight's the night that we'd be doing it.
You know, when it comes to marketability, we did have our comps surveyed, and our marketability shows that we're in strong marketable position. You know, it gets down to, whose figures you're gonna follow, and it's the old saying, I suspect, a little bit about statistics, right? So you gotta make those determinations. We'll get to an end eventually.
As long as you're comfortable with the reserve fund that exists there, I don't have a lot of interest in looking at a mill levy increase.
Yeah, I don't think any of us do, so. But if we did, now's the time.
Right.
Okay.
In the summary that we received, there's a paragraph here, and I don't know if this is the place to talk to about it, because it might be something that we address in the August 7th meeting. But it does say, the general fund was adjusted by adding $120,000 to the finance department for general overhead. To balance that, transfers with the capital improvement reserve fund and equipment reserve fund were both decreased by $40,000, and the $40,000 in the city manager's office for the citizens survey was eliminated. I was wondering if if it is relevant to the conversation tonight, or if this is a conversation that we can have on August 7th, to understand a little bit more about the citizen survey and the decision around that.
The city has engaged in the citizen survey on a fairly regular interval, and the recommendation was, when you get down to the point where you're trying to figure out what you can add and what you can cut, that kind of fell to that line. I don't know who on staff is our expert on citizen survey. Casey is.
So our last citizen survey was in 2015, and that regular interval, we were trying to do every 3 years. And so the concept was we missed doing it. I think also there was some conversation during the strategic plan of trying to align it with that cycle to where you would have your 2 years of a strategic plan and then survey to see how the public thought you all were doing related to that strategic plan. But as Tom mentioned, when it came down to balancing things, that was one that we felt that we had to recommend not funding in lieu of other priorities.
And one of the things I would tell you is we're also recommending something new, and that's the disproportionate minority contact survey, which is in conjunction with the county. And I'm sitting down to meet with county reps from Baldwin, Eudora, and the university, so that unlike some previous arrangements in those collaborations, I'm going to broach the issue of the other communities participating in the costs of those beyond the county taxes, which we all pay, and the university participating in that as well. But we've budgeted $50,000. Should we have difficulty, I think the study cost is in the $175,000 range, which I think is in the mid-80s if you split it just 2 ways. I think the study and the payment cycle, or the county being able to upfront, a difference if that's necessary, the $50,000 should accommodate that. So what I'm essentially saying is the DMC to me took precedent over the citizen survey at this point, and I think it's one of those things that, as a manager, you have to balance those things and make those considerations, and I felt that was important. I was convinced that the vetting of the consultant was sufficient, and I think that they have a very strong background in this sort of study. As you may know, we went through a study in the previous place I was employed. And so I think there's real value to this, but you really need kind of an academic exposure to the researchers that do this, because there's a lot of metrics that go into this analysis, and tying things together is really critical. So that to me took precedent over the citizen survey.
I appreciate that. I think that's pretty much the heart of the question that I was asking, making sure that that wasn't the survey. But then also, I think that we do the Lawrence Listens and a lot of other reaching out opportunities that we can maybe look at. And you said that there are other things that you're looking at, so I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, my intention would be to have the city come back to the citizen survey the following year.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Brian? Okay, I think we probably need to do public comment on this, right? So, public comment on authorizing publication of the 2019 budget summary and establishing August 7th, 2018 as a public hearing date.
Good evening, Mayor, Vice Mayor, Commissioners. Ted Boyle, North Lawrence Improvement. I've heard a lot of discussion about the budget, 18-19 amendment and everything, but and also raising the mill levy, putting the burden back on the property owners as usual. But residents that I've talked to and that have communicated with me, they want to know how this $2.2 million windfall that the city got that was unexpected, how it's going to affect the budget or the neighborhoods or the use of that money. Has anybody determined that yet? Or was it still in limbo? And that's the questions I get asked, and that's the question that I'm asking.
I think that was on number 4, not number 5, Ted, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. The transfer of roughly $2 million from the general fund to the capital improvement fund is where most of that money was going. and that was in 2018. The $200,000 expenditure authority for the Housing Trust Fund was 200,000 of that. Now, someone from staff can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's where that 2.25 million went in the 2018. And again, we're talking about 2019 budget summary, not,
Yeah.
but it
I
was
understand
2018, and so
So
that's what we're doing now.
you're telling me the money went into the general fund?
Money went
Large
from the general fund to the capital improvement fund,
Right.
and a small part to the housing.
Okay, then the
Right.
capital improvement fund, is it gonna trickle down to the neighborhoods of what they need down in the capital improvement area?
We're gonna turn to Brian on that.
You know, since we had to go into debt for traffic calming devices, so it's a question that's being brought up to me.
Yeah, Ted, do you have other questions before we turn to
No.
Brian? Okay, thanks. Thanks, Sherry.
Yeah, thank you. Mayor, I wasn't sure if you wanted us to address all the questions at the end or as.
Well,
they-
I think probably since this was on the last one anyway, Brian.
What I have up here is the CIP for the capital improvement reserve. I believe the question was how the funds in the capital reserve fund be spent. I will point out, of the transfer, $1 million is for the sidewalk mitigation program. 800,000 of that is for the public portion. $200,000 of that is for the city property and also the management of that program. I think that's the more, the kind of the highest use of that,
Right.
of that transfer.
Thank you, Brian. Does that answer your question, Ted? Okay, we're glad to help. Well, it was easy for Brian. Okay, other public comment. This time we'll go back to number 5, which is 2019.
Good evening, Michael Allman. One of the members of the 19th Street Neighborhoods Coalition, and I'd like to address the Waterline $325,000 design fund for repairs, to accommodate repairs. As a result of Vice Mayor Larson's line of inquiry on the May 1st meeting with the Public Works Director and the engineer about the pavement condition index, apparently that's what came down finally as the reason why Public Works does not want to repair the road. Well, the reason that, according to what Commissioner Larson figured out, was Mr. Sowell said when they dug those holes, they ruined the subgrade, from the text, from the quote. The engineer said, I don't know if we've done a whole lot of maintenance out there because we were planning on reconstructing it. So they purposely did not follow standard operating procedures to repair the subgrade anytime you fix a water line. In other words, demolition by neglect. The road was not maintained. Because it was not maintained, the BCI dropped from 49 to 24, and they said, oops, we can't repave it. Our position has been from day one, we want the road repaved at 22 feet, and what we're asking tonight is that the scope of the design project, not necessarily this one, but include an option for 31 feet like they're considering, 36 feet possibly, and 22 feet. Because it can be done. Actually, Kansas Statute 13-1042, re-improvement of streets, governing body may recurb, repave, or re-macadamize. Macadamize is what we're asking for. It's a macadam road. You have the authority to do that. You were misled by Public Works. They didn't follow standard operating procedure. They destroyed the subbase. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
I think it'd be fair to ask Mr. Souls to respond to the last comments. Those are his theories of what did or didn't happen, and I think I would say to you that the water main likely had a lot to do with whether the city continued to invest money in a road that would have to be torn up to replace the water main, which is sub-road base. So I'd ask Mr. Souls to address kindly the words of Mr. Holman.
Okay.
Good evening. I'm not quite sure where all that context was, but we never would make a repair that wasn't adequate. Our crews are very professional. We don't want to have to go back and refill another hole. What is it, 19th Street is an old chip seal road. There's not much there. There never was much there. And when it was taken over by the city, the traffic was fairly minimal. It hasn't had a lot of maintenance. I'm sure we've done some maintenance. I'd have to look back at the records. You know, but as we talked in the scope issue, when we sit down with the neighborhood, 22 feet, if that's an option, we can discuss that. You know, we want to make sure we have a safe road. We want to make sure it's a multimodal, has multimodal uses. We want to make sure it's adequate for not just now, but also in the future. But we don't want to overbuild the road either. You know, we've presented several projects already where we wanted to reduce lanes. We don't want to spend money just to spend money. But I will correct, I guess, Mr. Ullman in the fact that we don't make minimal repairs, or we do not neglect our duties in making those repairs. We've not failed in that performance way.
I think the other thing that, at least it's my understanding that that there is a concern about how you design, especially the elevation of the water line. And if the city is ever going to, you know, long after some of us around here are gone, is ever going to consider a more enhanced road than the basic road, that may be a different elevation of water line. And so I think the conversation, at least amongst staff, is so that we don't go in there and build a water line that you may build at a more shallow elevation at this point versus what you would have to do with a cut and fill with a fully improved street. Wouldn't it make sense to do a design for a more improved street so that at some point in the future you don't have to redo the elevation of certain sections of that line? At least that's kind of what I was understanding.
And it's not just vertical. I was sitting here thinking, it's also horizontal.
Right.
We have a 22-foot street and we don't have bike lanes or sidewalks. I mean, we don't want to put all of our new infrastructure over top of these water lines if we don't have to. You know, so if we build it out, or if at some point we have a design to make it wider for whatever reason, whether it's bike lanes or whether it's a bicycle separated facility, we don't want to put the water line right under there either. So if we have enough right-of-way, or do we need an easement to put that water line in so we don't have these, you know, facilities on top of those water lines, so that when something does happen, or somebody needs to tie in a new business, a new development somewhere, they need to tie in, then we don't have to dig up the street or the bike track or improvements that we've just done.
I appreciate your comments, Tom and Chuck. One thing that I'd point out is that, you know, the other end of 19th Street, you know, is pretty rough right now. It doesn't have the PCI that the east side has, but we intentionally deferred working on that street while that construction project was going on at KU, on the Central District. You know, the western end of that.
You mean 19th?
19th.
By Iowa?
Yeah, by Iowa, on the west side.
Yeah,
Of it. Right.
yeah.
So, you know, you're not putting a lot of money into fixing those those holes right now. We're gonna limp along with it the way it is, right?
Right, because we know that
Because-
we had a project coming up
Right.
and we didn't figure, and we did ask KU to do some minor
Right.
maintenance, and we
Yeah.
did some,
Yeah.
just
Right.
because we had to, because it
Right,
got so bad.
exactly, but, you know, we knew that street needed to be worked on.
Mhm.
We also knew that there was gonna be a construction project for a couple years with a lot of trucks, so we, you know, we didn't wanna put a new street in and then have it all
Right.
torn up, so, you know, I think that there's maybe an appearance that we don't care about 19th Street on the west end, but we'll get there. And I think the same thing's true for the east side. You know, we care about that street. You guys have been doing what you can to take care of it. But when a water line breaks, that messes a lot of things up, so. Any other comment on that, or can we move on to the next public comment? Thank you.
My name's Pat Cady. I'm also with the 19th Street Coalition, and I don't have a comment on what you were just talking about. But I have a question. As far as my recollection goes, the last time we met before you, and we met before the Transportation Commission before that, it was voted on that there would be a, I think it's $325,000 study done about the road, the East 19th Street Road. Where is that? Is that now in the, in this budget, or is that put off? Or can someone tell me what's happening with that?
I don't know about a quote study per se, but again, when we start into the design, I mean, we will look at all the different options. And we will take a look at the traffic volumes and stuff like that, and the improvements that are needed, what kind of facilities we want. We'll include the neighborhood. I mean, all this will be done at the same time. I don't know that we ever were intending to do a separate study and then do a design. Typically, we would do that together.
Excuse me, but there was a specific motion for $325,000 for design, and that would include 3 options: a 47-foot wide road.
Well, I think the design is what we're talking about, and we're talking about $325,000 for the engineering. I think that's what it was.
A study about that.
Well, I mean, that's the engineering. It's not a.
No, it was a design, an engineering design for that road, with 2 different widths that you folks voted on, but it's confusing. Are we? Are we?
Chuck, you may just make a comment about where that solicitation process is for those design consultant services.
Say that again?
Where are we at in the RFP process?
We've had RFPs, and I believe they've gone through and talked with engineers, but yet we will get to all those options through the design work and discuss that with the neighborhood, all those design options.
And that's what's staying in this budget.
Yes.
Right.
So we're looking at 2019 then, correct?
For the engineering design study.
Yes,
Right.
that's my question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so Brandon, that's right?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay.
In fact, I think that is the solicitation for proposals out on the street now?
Yes.
Yeah, so.
In fact, we could start that even earlier, you know, because it's gonna take several months to get through this. I mean, but it's not like the 9th Street corridor where we did an 18-month,
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
study, if you wanna call it, and then we went to the design. This is going to be, we'll provide all the options, we'll put with all the options with the neighbors, and we'll come back to the commission, for you to decide on the final design before we step into it.
Thank you.
I'm sorry I'm so dense about this, but you will provide the options to us. You will, the neighborhood. Okay, so our chance to tell you what options we would like is not now, but later? Or is later too late?
We will be coming to the neighborhood before we make any decisions to discuss with the neighborhood, the options available, and see what the neighborhood wants to do.
Yeah, okay. Well, I was just thinking, from a budgetary perspective, if you're going to tell a designer, here are 3 options, give me, design out for all 3 of these and give us an idea of how much they would all cost. If the neighborhood strongly did not want one of the options as the 47-foot wide road, is now the time to say that
No.
and save you guys some money?
No, not now. During the process.
So you want to,
Yeah.
spend the
Because
money anyway?
that money would not be in this budget. It would be in the 2020 budget or the 2021 budget. We're doing 2019 now, and it's
Yeah,
the
I know.
325 that's in
But he
this
just
budget.
said this is for the 2019, that will be in the 2019 budget.
The $325,000, right, that's it. No construction.
Yeah, I know, I know there's no construction. I came up to ask about the design stuff.
Yeah.
I'm Bonnie Effman. I still find this very confusing. I don't feel like we're getting real straight, clear answers. I don't understand what's being said, and I've been trying to listen very closely. My understanding, back when this was last discussed here, was that the staff would go back and come up, send out the request for proposals for 2 designs. And what I understood is that that would be 31 and 47 feet. And I don't understand spending the money on the 47 feet design even if I heard, I'm pretty sure, at least 3 commissioners saying that seems like way too much. So my question, similar to what Pat was saying, is so why do we put money into studying that even? If we know the neighborhoods don't want it, the commissioners don't want it, that seems like money down the tubes. And we're talking about for 2019 is when that money would be spent.
Right,
So
for
it seems
325.
appropriate to
Yeah.
be discussing right now.
We're going to expenditure authority, not,
Yeah, I think I understand just a little bit of the, so the purpose of the $325,000 is the process to work with the local neighborhoods before we would ever pick what size of the street we would have.
We're not gonna, we're not gonna do,
So-
we're not gonna do
But-
detailed designs for all the
So-
different options.
So the 325 is not to design a specific size of street. It's to design based on what the community input is and what the governing body does.
Right, it'll get to final design though. I mean, after we
Yeah,
go through this,
right.
it's kinda like on Castle. We provide the commission and the neighbors, we work with the neighborhoods to come up with, I can't remember, 3 or 4 designs, 3? And we presented that to, you want me to come up
speaking
here?
of Mike, or come up. Yeah. Thanks.
This process will be very similar to what we did on Castle. You know, we had the neighborhood, we had a lot of interest on both ends, we had commercial nodes. We sat down with everybody. We not only came up with designs that we had heard that the neighborhood wanted, but we came up with our recommendation for design. The neighborhoods wanted a larger facility. Our recommendation was a smaller facility. And we brought that to the commission and you decided how you wanted to proceed. It will be similar to that. We will, I understand they may not want a 47-foot, what they think is a 47-foot, but if that is our professional opinion that we should take a look at, then we want to present that to you, and we want to give you the information that you need to make the appropriate decision. If a 22-foot option is what the neighborhood wants, we'll present that to you, and we'll give you that appropriate information.
But you're not going to do a full design
Not
of,
until you make that decision.
right, not until we make,
But we need to have enough information to give you and the neighborhood the right information.
thank you, Chuck.
Mhm.
And thank you, Brian.
Does that work?
Other public comment on the 2019 budget summary and establishing August 7th, 2018 as a public hearing date. Okay, well, let's bring it back.
Well, I like the changes that were made from the last discussion we had on this. I'm glad that we are having money for the loop and also the other changes that were made. I'm satisfied with them.
That does bring one question up. I'm sorry, I didn't get this in earlier. The parking garage.
Well, that's right, we're going to talk
Yeah.
about that.
We moved two projects off the CIP. One was the aquatic center, the other one was the parking garage. And I just wanted to clarify, the parking garage decision, was it part of that loop discussion, or was it something else?
There was something else, Mayor. We had some discussion with our parking consultant, who provided us a little bit of advice regarding this potential garage that we visited with you all about, that we were talking about in conjunction with the proposed mixed-use grocery project. And as a result of the recommendations from our consultant, which we'll be following up and providing you all a briefing on, the consultant did not believe that a garage would be necessary with that project. And so we wanted to include that information, at least in this proposed budget. We don't believe that that would be an imminent cost for 2019.
So the net effect of excluding the garage was about $5 million on our $6 million?
$6 million.
Is that correct? So our CIP went down by $6 million on that?
That's correct, with the city share being $2 million.
Just remember that there are other sources
Right.
for
Right.
that, special assessments and
Yeah.
fees and
Right.
other things,
Yeah,
developer fees as well.
Yeah.
So it
Private
wasn't the
partnership.
full amount.
yeah, so, yeah, great.
It was
But
split.
again, that was not part of that loop consideration, it was a separate deal.
Yeah, that's correct.
Outside factors.
Right.
So that $6 million was split up three ways: geodebt, private partnerships, and special assessments. So
Yeah.
that's
Okay. I'm also happy with the changes. I appreciate staff's work on that. It was a long meeting last week, and then you had a couple days to get that figured out. So thank you very much for taking care of that.
Well, I'm satisfied as well. I know it's hard not to look at that $2 million. Of course, that's in 2018, but $6 million now in this case and just go crazy with it. But, you know, we're looking so far into the future and anything can happen from then until now. So it's good to have some reserves.
I would move that we authorize publication of the 2019 budget summary and establish August 7th, 2018 as public hearing date.
Second.
We have a motion from Commissioner Herbert, second from Commissioner Ananda. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you all.
It's like, $6 million. $6 million. Start writing checks out.
Except for they were special assessments.
Right, right. I get that, but still.
Our next item, again, is the strategic plan update. Danielle?
So I'm Danielle Bushcutter. I work in the city manager's office, and I'll keep this relatively brief. We try to come back to you every 4 months with an update to our strategic plan. And we have a webpage that updates each of the priority initiatives and any indicators related to the critical success factors that are outlined in the strategic plan. A couple things I do want to highlight.
instead of going through each of the priority initiatives, one that I want to highlight is the one related to boards and commissions. We did add an item to this since our last update to you all, and that was related to the Airport Advisory Board, and reviewing the responsibilities and membership of that board. So we did add that item to that initiative. And there's a more detailed memo kind of outlining where the progress is on a number of those kind of individual action items, as we call them, under that specific priority initiative. The other thing that I wanted to highlight related to that is we recently became aware of an appointments project, which is an initiative of the Women's Foundation, which is based in Kansas City. So we'll be bringing forward some additional information regarding that in the near future. So outside of that, I won't go through each of the priority initiatives unless you guys have specific questions and want us to, but just wanted to give you, let you guys know that those initiatives have been updated online, and there's a memo kind of highlighting what changes have been made since the last time we brought this forward to you all. I have a question.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
The high-speed fiber, I can't help to look at that and feel sad that we haven't seemed to do anything. And I know Brandon's a busy guy. I don't even know where he is now, but
There he is. He'll come back.
there he is. I waited till he went to the bathroom before I'd bring him up. You want to touch on that?
Sure, sorry, I missed your question.
The
I'm fighting
high-speed
a cold.
fiber,
I was,
we haven't really done much on it in 2 years.
from the city perspective, where we kind of left off was adopting the dark fiber policy to try to encourage, development, deployment of private fiber. We've had 2 dark fiber agreements that the commission has adopted or has approved since then, with internet service providers, one of which is providing service in the community, and they're doing a great job with their target market, which is more big commercial customers. The other is actually not yet providing service in the community, which is a bit of an issue. We need that provider to make some progress there, which is a requirement of that dark fiber lease agreement. Also, since that dark fiber policy, and I think since the City Commission strategic plan was adopted, Midco has come to town. And they've been, I think, a great asset to the community so far. They're making significant investments in their fiber network, which is a citywide fiber network. And then I think you're also seeing some of their competitors make investments as well, probably, namely AT&T, with their citywide network.
So I love everything that you just said, but when I go to the strategic planning webpage and I click on, it doesn't show anything that you just said.
Right. It's on my work list to provide a report back to the City Commission within this horizon. I think we have another year that we're working on this strategic plan. And I was hoping to get to it the first half of the year.
Right.
But we've had obviously a number of other issues that weren't planned.
Right.
That have come on our radar and have taken quite a bit of my time as well. So I just haven't been able, I'm kind of the coordinator out of the city manager's office for this. I just haven't had time on my work plan.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping to shift some of my focus to that here in the second half of this year.
Yeah, because when I look at it, I don't even understand the progress indicators,
Right. I think you'll see a new right-of-way ordinance coming forward, hopefully in September. That's the status update I got actually today. And that has a lot, I think that will be very important in how we work with those internet service providers within the right-of-way. Obviously, they depend on the use of the right-of-way to be able to develop their citywide networks.
I guess we just need to communicate this better, because when I looked at this, it was just like, oh, man.
Right.
But, okay, so, yeah.
I will say, what the staff took away from the City Commission strategic planning process regarding that issue or that goal, was to see private sector development, and I think we can confidently say that we're seeing that development.
Yeah, I had a question about the downtown master plan.
Yep. That's where I was at too.
Okay.
Fire away.
Yeah, it says in here that they were supposed to select a firm by July 17th. Is that still?
No, we had a little bit of a timing error. Yep. I should have mentioned that when I was up here. A little bit of a timing error from when we actually made the updates. We did that about a month ago. So I think that's anticipated to be on the next agenda, or one of the next few agendas, yeah. So my apologies for that.
But I don't remember seeing it on the consent.
It was not there.
Yeah.
That was my same exact question.
Okay. Do you have another one, or is that it?
No.
Okay, anybody?
I was really happy to get our first correspondence that had to do with priority-based budgeting. That was very exciting for me. I don't know about for you, Casey, because we went to the same class, but it was for me.
I'm just happy to see the progress we've had in the past year or more. I echo Commissioner Soden regarding the.
Well, you know, I
fiber.
think we probably ought
Oh,
to ask questions and then have public comment.
Oh, public comment.
I have a question, and that is, we kind of stumbled across a new board, or a previously undiscovered board, which is the Joint Board of Mental Health. There's an interlocal agreement from 1986, and part of that is that the members of the joint board, this is a joint board with the county, will be responsible for administering the interlocal agreement and reporting to the city and county as requested. So I'm interested in kind of an update on where we are with that, and are we working on that?
Mayor, I mean, this board has been active for some time. We have known about this board. I think the issue recently was the interlocal agreement that we posted with the agenda this evening, which is from the 80s.
Right, but I mean, this board is separate from the Burt Nash board, according to the terms of the agreement, the interlocal agreement. So my question is, are they meeting quarterly? And
I was not aware of that, Mayor, is the question, so I apologize.
Yeah.
I don't know, and I'll have to look into that further.
so, yeah, I'd appreciate.
Okay.
Yeah.
So are you suggesting there's two separate boards
Yes.
in operation?
The members, I mean, it's attached to the agenda. You can take a look at it. The 6th point says there is hereby established a joint board of mental health. The joint board shall consist of 5 members, 2 to be selected by the city, 2 to be selected by the county, and the 5th member to be jointly selected by the city and county.
Oh, that's the current one.
The joint board shall be responsible for administering this agreement, the interlocal agreement, and its duties shall include receiving and reviewing reports from the center, which is Burt Nash, reporting to the city as county as requested, making budget recommendations to the county, and performing such other administrative tasks as from time to time requested by the city or county. It goes on to say, the members of the joint board shall serve concurrent terms as full voting members of the center's board of directors. So from this, I understand that there is a separate entity called the Mental Health Board, and there are concurrent terms on the Burt Nash Center's board of directors.
I am not aware of that, Mayor. I'm aware of that there's a Burt Nash board, which because one of the appointments that was recently being discussed, a joint appointment,
Right.
was related to that particular board. So I'm sorry, I didn't realize that there was a question about the distinction. To my knowledge, I'm not aware that there are 2 boards. I believe the Burt Nash board.
That's
does that
kind of why
function,
I'm asking about this.
But I can certainly look into it further.
You know, as you know, we've raised this issue about these intergovernmental agreements, and I suspect that this mental health board is what we now refer to as the Burt Nash Board. One may have morphed or not. But are there two separate functioning boards out there? Because the position that you're talking about, the joint appointment, was filled by the sheriff, right?
Well, I beg to differ.
Well, no, I'm asking the question.
No.
I'm not trying
that's
to
not
differ.
this. We have Patrick here. He might be able to help us out.
Okay.
I mean, yeah.
Hiding in the shadow.
Do I need to sign in or anything?
Tell us who you are.
Sure, I'm Patrick Schmitz, the CEO for Burt Nash. So, yeah, actually the existence of the mental health, what's the exact title, the mental health board, was somewhat of a mystery to me until we started looking into these as well. It almost seems like it's a board within a board, as if there are the members of the joint appointee and then the two separate so the five are a board that sits inside of the Burt Nash board. And that has its own bylaws, its own chair, vice chair, or chair-elect. That could be completely separate from the chair-elect than the full board. It's pondering to me as well. I have no record that they have met for, at least certainly not during my period of time being here, which is now 13 months. And when they last met, we don't know, honestly. We are trying to find those records, but they would be currently archived at Iron Mountain and probably Topeka. So we're trying to figure out what that is and when they stopped meeting. So we're with you in being confused as to their existence, their purpose, and their activity.
Well, I mean, one of the things that this interlocal agreement says is that the county will levy a tax in support of mental health services. And this board was to make recommendations to the county as to the level of that taxation. The city's agreement was to provide a facility. Now, this is an agreement from 1986. I'm not sure that we have anything more current, but if this is the agreement that we have that was approved by the state, I think we need to, at least consider it.
There are some subsequent agreements that deal with the community health facility, since that was constructed. But I'm not aware of any other interlocal agreement related to this particular topic. So, as I think the city manager said, this is an example of a number of interlocal agreements that haven't been looked at for some time, and perhaps there was a morphing at one point to the current Burt Nash board. I don't know without looking into it more specifically as well.
It's kind of Exhibit A, isn't it? Unfortunately, I think what's happened is there's been some of these things have morphed on their own, based on kind of a mutual understanding that was not documented. And we've seen that in a number of agreements and contracts that we've looked at that need to be updated. And I think at times it's just indicative of what I've seen in terms of these relationships. They need to all be gone back through, and we need to have a renegotiation of the terms of these agreements to start with, let alone a realignment of who's doing what. And that's a huge challenge, and at some point, I think we need to get on the same page as the county board to have that discussion. Now, we raised this issue as a part of the budget presentation this year about those issues, and that was more from an equity standpoint, but we also pointed out that it's important from a management standpoint. I just don't think when you look at a hierarchy of an organization that you end up reporting to two distant heads, and I think that creates some of this issue. And I think we need to get back at these agreements, decide what the original authorization agreement was, and does that align with what we're doing today or what we should be doing today? And so that's going to take a lot of work. But first off, we have to have some sort of reach some sort of understanding with our partner here, the county, that we can get back on that page and go that direction. And there's a lot of major issues and goals, in my opinion, that we should try to achieve with that realignment.
And mental health is a significant issue in our community. I think this is a very important place to at least start.
We were gonna, remember, our recommendation was to start with fire/medical.
Well, we're on with that as well, but this is a significant topic.
Yeah, they all are.
And since we have a board that we're confused about, I'd like to try to figure that out.
I do have a question. This is a really broad question. But of course, you know, for several years now, I've been talking about merging departments in some fashion with the county. When you're doing this global review of all of our agreements and trying to parse out, you know, who is doing what and to what degree, is it also the time and place to start talking about merging different departments, or even the crazier idea of merging city-county government?
Yeah, one of the things that I've recommended more recently, and some of you may have gotten some feedback, and you have the #1 city manager program in the country located right here in Lawrence at the University of Kansas. And it seems to me that at the same time we're going through these agreements, we could work something out with the university to have them really do a study, you know, starting maybe with the options, okay? And the bigger option being a Unigov type operation. And I don't want you to necessarily think of some other place that's a Unigov right now, because it's my belief that this community will ultimately end up shaping what that actually looks like. I mean, this community will tell you, okay? And there's certain things that I think align maybe better than others, but of the places I've worked in, you know, the 6 places that I've worked, this place to me has the most likelihood of success in something like that. You have one major dominant community in the entire county that is the majority of the population, a significant portion of the property valuation. I just think that there's a lot of opportunity there. There's obviously some level of spirit of collaboration here. I just think that, you know, we've let it drift for so long that, you know, it's almost Herculean to back up and climb that mountain to redraft these things and get them back in perspective. But I think some sort of connection back to the university, and actually, when I gave a talk, the chancellor was sitting in the audience when I talked about this very issue. And I think they get it. And the former director of the public policy program that a number of the people sitting in this room graduated from, he was pretty keen on the idea too. And in fact, Stuart and I have had conversations with the chancellor and that individual. So I think those opportunities exist for us. It's not going to be done overnight, but I'd like to have the longer range goal in mind that we're also working on these other realignments at the same time. It's just, quite frankly, I don't think necessarily we're, you know, we got to get to the same page with the county. We got to open up that conversation with the county. And I think well, I think quite frankly, it's going to be ultimately it's going to have to be board to board. I think because it is a major political decision. We both, you know, have kind of a council manager orientation between the two entities, where both, I mean, it shouldn't be a competition factor between the two incumbents, because we're both of a stage where we won't be here when that actually happens. But I think
your favorite word is attrition.
Yeah, that's right. And so I just think that there's those opportunities. I think, you know, the goals can be enhanced service and, you know, a more efficient governance.
Should we like plan some kind of joint board meeting, or, I mean, how do we approach this?
Well, I think you guys should have that conversation yourselves and what your comfort is amongst us staff, and see how you want to do that. It'll all be public, but, you know, this conversation's going to be in the paper tomorrow, so.
Sure.
You know.
Well, I'm asking you because you're the one with the experience, so.
Well, but I have you know, I have an education in urban and regional governance, and, you know, being a Minnesota, I grew up in that Metro Council environment. But I can tell you, there is, again, that it's really something that we should be studying. And it's, both organizations are pretty sound organizations that have a lot of ability. There's things like land use that you share right now between the city and the county. That's usually one of the biggest obstacles, okay? And you've already combined that service to some degree. I think maybe some of the smaller jurisdictions might want to retain some of that authority, and you can segment those things out pretty effectively, I think. But, that's really a long-range kind of
Yeah.
issue.
Yeah.
But with this program at the university, I think you could get a lot of really sound advice. You have academics that cross all disciplines. You have students coming in here who have advanced. I can tell you that the students I've worked with at the city that came from that program, I mean, there's a reason they're number one. I mean, their alumni are incredible. Their alumni are all over this country, managing cities and counties all over this country right now.
So when you say that we should all talk about this together, would that be a work session item, or do we just say, hey, let's send a letter to KU and see if they're interested in?
I've already kind of raised that issue, but,
Researching, or-
but you can endorse it,
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
I think there's some interest there, but it has to evolve. We have to talk to the
It's very
director.
complicated.
Yeah,
I
it's,
think the first step is to get with the county, have a
Yeah.
meeting with them.
so do I.
I
mean,
think that's the first step, and then between the two commissions, decide.
I would suggest that maybe the mayor talk to the chair of the county board, maybe the two of them sit down over
Is that
coffee
Nancy?
and have this conversation. Maybe they
It's like
invite
the
the
task
administrators
forces.
from both places
Yeah.
and
Joint
start it
task
that way.
Yeah.
And then bring back that conversation.
I want to be on it.
It's not a fait accompli, but
No,
it's,
no.
maybe an ambition that we should
Well,
consider.
I know that's not our agenda item, so I'm not going to make any kind of motion or anything.
Yeah, we're getting a little far afield.
Yeah. Well, thank you very
Thank
much,
you for
Patrick.
the
We
conversation.
appreciate your
Thank you.
contribution.
Bringing it up, Mayor.
Okay. Public comment on the strategic plan. Okay. I think we've received the update.
Can I ask a quick question, Mayor?
Sure.
Can you walk me through, so we're nearing the end of the 2-year period for this strategic plan. I wasn't here
No.
when we did the previous,
No.
well, it's 2017, early March 2017. Sorry, I'm already it's already 2019 in my brain. But we're,
The timeline a bit.
yeah, if you could, thank you.
Yep, absolutely. So it was
Sorry to-
initially adopted in March of 2017. And then in November, right after the election, I think it was that work session in November, we came back and basically reaffirmed what had been approved in that March 2017. So that really kicked off the next 2 years. So we'll address it again in 2019. So there was a bit of an odd timing at the beginning of it. So more of a 3-year plan, this initial go-around, and then it'll, with every election, be updated.
So the thought process was this. Every 2 years, you have an election. And it's time to affirm that everybody is still on the same page following that election. Now, you have a lame duck period, a pretty extensive lame duck period, the way the state law works now. Elections are in November. You don't take office until your first meeting in January.
Second.
And so, I've run into that before, and so I kind of brought that same kind of thought process here. And what was happening was, the incumbents, are on, and, through the end of the year. And then who the new ones, the newly elected ones that may be different, we sat everybody down together. And in that lame duck period, and had those conversations so that the new members could hear from the old members who are returning and those that are leaving as to why that was their strategic plan, and the new ones who are out surveying the public before November have some new information, right? And so then they can engage in that conversation about why it was, and the new ones can argue for what it should be. The whole concept is to make sure that more than just a majority supports the strategic plan and how it's going to look going forward. So that's why we shaped it that way, so that it immediately follows. So you don't get into a situation where you're out of sync with, who your elected officials are and their support for the strategic plan, because that drives your budget, it drives your capital improvements program, it drives so many things that operate. And if you're not on base, the thought process, if you're not on base to start with, it's just gonna create a lot more energy, needed energy to get things accomplished.
I think I definitely hear that perspective, and I think that's valuable. I think for me, when I came onto the commission, we did have a conversation around it, but at the same time, if you're newly elected to the commission, you're still learning the lay of the land, and I think it's irresponsible to come in and swagger in changes when you don't understand process in a lot of ways, or you haven't developed an understanding of the way that meetings work on a regular basis, et cetera. So, 6 months in, I would have a far different comfort level contributing to a strategic plan, particularly with being the only new commissioner on the commission. And so I wonder if, we could consider the possibility of reviewing that in a study session during the first month of a new commissioner's time on the commission, and then reassessing that 6 months later. And I acknowledge that that's my experience, and it might not be for someone else. They might be ready to blow it up and make a lot of changes right immediately. But that's not the way that I process. So when we had that conversation when I first came onto the commission, I wasn't prepared to speak to that in a way that I felt competent or helpful to really looking at what the strategic plan looks like for the community and how it's been implemented and how we want to move forward. Even though I did have the pulse of the community and all of those things, there's also functionality and role. So I just want to put that out there for consideration, because I would feel competent having an in-depth conversation about what I see as the vision for this community at this point that I wasn't prepared to have in January.
I think your comments are valuable because you're the first one that's gone through it. And so I think that's good for your fellow commissioners to hear that. And I think that you should enter in that dialogue with your commissioners and see if there isn't, maybe some time sequence kind of adjustments that should be made to accommodate that thought process. Because I think it's a valuable comment from you, having just gone through it.
I think it also, it's gonna depend on each election cycle too, because, this was an election cycle, for instance, where both Lisa and I were retained. And so I think in a lot of ways, there isn't a huge push to put everything in a blender and chop it up. Whereas, the election cycle before, when, myself and Leslie and Stuart came on, that was one where there were no retained incumbents. And that, I think, the conversation begins pretty quickly of, get the blender out, because maybe the priorities we had 10 minutes ago are no longer the majority priorities. So you almost have to take it one election at a time.
Yeah, it's contextual.
But we've done a great job, the three of us.
Well, I guess my question is, I think that if there's something that you feel like we need to put in the strategic plan, some modification we need to do to accommodate something that you perceive as a priority that we're not addressing, that we need to know that. And we may not be able to deal with that now, but having that information would certainly inform the discussion as we go forward and continue with this, and then go into the next one. So, I mean, we would have a chance, if nothing else, to be thinking about, well, gosh, what did we miss? So,
Or just what's different.
Yeah, or what's different, yeah. So-
Okay, I would like to think about that, and maybe that's something that I can bring back as a commission item.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Right, yeah.
Good time.
Okay, well, I think we've received that. I'm not sure there's any other direction we need to provide at this point.
Great conversation.
Okay. on to the next, which is to consider authorizing the city manager to execute agreement with Westar Energy.
Good evening, Mayor and Commissioners. I'm Tony Wheeler, the city attorney. This item was deferred from the commission's agenda last week, and it is a follow-up item from our meeting on May 15th. At that meeting, the commission directed staff to draft an indemnity agreement with Westar for the installation of 3,000 Kelvin LED fixtures in certain streetlights in the city of Lawrence. And that agreement is before you tonight. Under this agreement, Westar will install LED lights with a correlated color temperature not to exceed 3,000 Kelvin in those streetlights in Lawrence that are due for replacement. In exchange for this installation by Westar, the city will indemnify Westar for all claims and judgments, including reasonable attorney's fees, where the brightness of the lighting, street lighting lamp, or lack thereof, is an essential element of the claim. The term of the agreement provides that it will be effective until IES formally recognizes that LED lamps with a CCT not to exceed 3,000 Kelvin are as safe as LED lamps with a CCT of 4,000 Kelvin, or until Westar determines such lamps shall be a standard fixture pursuant to the street lighting tariff. So I just want to highlight a couple provisions of that indemnity agreement that is before you. This agreement will ensure that the city's obligation to indemnify Westar only comes into play when actual claims or actions where the brightness or lack thereof of the streetlight is an essential element of the claim. Not every action or claim made against Westar will be passed on to the city under this agreement. Further, in paragraph 3, the indemnity agreement is further limited. It does not apply to Westar's own negligence or willful misconduct, or to any conduct of Westar not involving the specified lamps. It only extends until IES, that's the Illuminating Engineering Society, formally recognizes 3,000 Kelvin lamps are as safe as 4,000 Kelvin lamps. And finally, in no case will the city's liability exceed the limits established by the Kansas Tort Claims Act. And that's a cap on damages that applies to municipalities but does not apply to Westar. And that cap is currently $500,000. It's the opinion of our office that this agreement follows through on the direction that we received from the commission, and I'd stand for any questions that you might have.
Questions for Tony?
On the agreement, a couple of possible options that I would ask us to look at. One is on item number 2, which is the city's covenant. Can we set that up, or would it be possible to have that as actual damages resulting from a final judgment?
Yes, I know that the commission has received some correspondence about that, and this is standard indemnification language. As you know, the expense, and I think it was even brought up tonight, the expense of any entity faces in defending lawsuits doesn't come from just the judgment. It is all of the actions that lead up to the judgment. There are significant expenses to parties in litigation, including investigating and evaluating claims, writing and responding to discovery requests, taking depositions, locating expert witnesses, and so on, preparing for trial. It is unlikely that Westar would agree to just an indemnity agreement that applies only to judgments. Randy and I were discussing it, and in our combined years as attorneys, we've never seen an indemnity agreement that was just limited to judgments. Now, is it possible? Yes, it might be possible that a party would agree to that if they were not in equal bargaining power, but I'm not sure if Westar would agree to that sort of limitation in this agreement. And it is not a standard provision in indemnity agreements.
And
Other
then-
questions?
Yeah, one more. Using the term brightness, my understanding is that's really color temperature, not brightness. That's what I've been.
Okay.
That's the only place I saw it, was that one place.
I think that, I could take that back to the other party, and I'm sure that they would object to that.
Okay.
But I'd have to check.
So we get to item number 4 on the, how long the agreement is effective for until they no longer consider it safe, or they consider it just as safe. So once it gets to that point, does that, and he says the indemnity agreement will basically go away, does that mean we lose our ability to have the 3,000 K lights? I don't know if there should be other language in there that said the city's obligation to indemnify under this agreement shall become effective until the IES formally recognizes.
That was our intention, that this indemnity agreement, the term would only continue for that period, and that our obligation to then step in and accept that indemnity or accept that liability is only until that time. So that was our intention. But what language or what words were you
Well,
suggesting?
the city's obligation to indemnify under this agreement shall be effective until the IES formally and continue on. I guess the key there is that if the indemnity agreement goes away, do we lose the 3,000 K lights?
I'll ask Randy to respond.
No, the 3,000 K lights would still be in place, but we would no longer have to indemnify Westar for the placement.
So they couldn't pull those away from us at that point? Okay.
Other questions for Tony? Okay, thank you. We'll go to public comment.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, Vice Mayor, Commissioners, Ted Boyle, North Lawrence Improvement. I want to tell you, since I put the moratorium on those lights, I haven't had any complaints because we haven't had any new ones installed. And all the ones that were installed in North Lawrence required me to call Westar and have them come over and put shielding on them. Even the lower temperature, the 3 kelvins, 3,000 or 300, had to be shielded. In a residential neighborhood, they're just, people don't want them. When they were installing them, I was getting phone calls, and then I have a number to a gentleman that comes out, and first thing he did was put the lower temperature ones in. I'd continue to get the phone calls. He'd come back and put the shielding in, and where the light just directly went straight down to the ground with no expanding light. And so, you know, the residents have expressed that they really don't want those LEDs. If you want to put them down like North 2nd, North 3rd, 6th Street, you know, a traffic way, whatever, that's fine. But in a residential neighborhood, I can guarantee you that Westar will be over putting shielding on every one of those lights in North Lawrence. And my assumption was that they said something is like $80 or $90 to put that shielding on there. So, you know, you take how many lights, if they change them out, and they're going to shield every one of them. So I want to make sure that that is possible, because when that light comes glaring into your bedroom or your backyard or your patio or your front porch and you can't sit outside, something has to be done. So that's our concern.
Thank you, Ted. Other public comment? Okay, let's take it back. Commission comment.
I was just trying to find on here if there's anything that we need to consider adding shielding to or not. What do you think?
Shielding.
I don't think that this agreement is the appropriate
Indemnification.
yeah,
Okay.
for that. I think, you know, from Ted's comments, I think Westar's been showing up to do it, so.
Okay.
I think Chuck could also speak to that. I think you've had some interaction with Westar on that, haven't you?
As far as the shielding?
Shielding, yeah.
Westar's been very responsive on the shielding. I don't know that adding shielding to this agreement, the whole point was to reduce the brightness or the
Right, color
CCT, the
temperature.
color temperature, so that we didn't have to do the shielding all the time.
Yeah.
So I think that's what some
No,
of the
that's part
concern
of it,
was.
yeah.
We could convey that on the existing lights, that,
Oh,
you know,
absolutely.
that they would still consider that.
Yeah.
But I think it's separate and distinct.
Yeah, I
from
think it's a
60.
separate issue from this.
Well, I just know that anytime we take the possible step of giving somebody limited liability, it concerns me from the city side. So I have a really hard time with maybe moving forward with this. I was hoping that, and maybe Tony can even explain it better, or more, I should say, not better, but, about our total liability that we have. Because I was thinking about that final judgment that I brought up. So when I read this again, it just seems to me that we probably wouldn't get involved with any lawsuits until there was a judgment that said, yes, the color temperature was the issue. Is that right?
No, under the language, we could be involved in a claim. So there could be a claim that is made against Westar related to the color temperature of the lights, and they could turn to us and ask us to step in and help them defend that claim. So that would be before a judgment.
Other comments? I'm interested in getting the 3,000 color temperature in. I mean, it seems to me like this is what we need to be able to do it. And it's nice to know we have someone who is brave about lawsuits among us.
I want to be clear, I don't seek them.
So I appreciate the Vice Mayor's concerns, but I think I'm going to support this because I want to get those bulbs in.
Concur?
I am open to the language change regarding temperature versus brightness. I
Oh,
think
yeah.
that's an important
I think
distinction.
That I kind of assumed that. So, yeah, and that's great.
I would make a motion, then we authorize the city manager to execute an agreement with Westar Energy Incorporated concerning streetlights.
With the understanding.
With the
With-
understanding that Tony will take the language change back to Westar and hopefully find agreement. Brightness
Brightness and
to
color temperature.
becomes color temperature.
Okay.
Second.
We have a motion, Commissioner Herbert, second Commissioner Ananda. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Nay.
Thank you. Come on. Okay. We're on to commission items.
I've two commission items. First of all, I had the opportunity just the other day to sit down and meet the new director of the Lawrence Community Shelter, and we had a pretty good conversation about the direction that's headed. And I know we've received some correspondence from Jackie Counts regarding a request for a work session, but as I met with both Jackie and the new director of the shelter, it occurred to us that probably a work session was going to be kind of short-sighted. And it actually fits in very nicely with the conversation we've been having tonight. So my commission item would be to request taking a look at putting together a joint county-city meeting. Not necessarily to have any impact, obviously, on the 2019 budget, but to look longer term in terms of what our expectations are at the shelter what we envision their services being, what role they play in the community. And I think this has to be a conversation that happens with the county. You know, Tom, you talk a lot about disproportionate taxation, that a lot of times a county service gets disproportionately put on Lawrence taxpayers. And as we look at the way our county government versus our city government is set up, a lot of times issues revolving around things like mental health fall in the lap of the county. When we talk about the shelter, it's undoubtedly a mental health aspect to this. So I'm trying to avoid making it sound like we're, you know, putting off our obligation onto the county, but I think a conversation needs to be had as to funding equities between the two bodies. It may be appropriate as well to invite the school district. In the past, we've had good meetings between the three of us, but I suppose this is kind of a public response to the request for a work session on the shelter. My recommendation would be that if we have such a work session, that it not just be the city commission. I think that's short-sighted in terms of planning. That's my first item, so.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you know, we had a tentative meeting set in April, and I think the decision was to defer that. And I suspect that as the summer comes to an end and budgets come to an end, we'll be looking at a joint session sometime in September. But I think it's the county's turn to host. And so I suspect that that will be brought up this September, and we can, you know, we always have multiple items on those agendas, so maybe we can add some of those.
Yeah, I appreciate your interest in having a broader conversation on this. I think that's great. And
My second item deals with our meeting last week. During one of the, as we talked about the mural, I was looking at the mural agreement specifically, and there was one part of it that I had taken issue with some specificity. But in discussing that item, I kind of lumped it into an overarching criticism that frankly involved me making a denigrating comment that could have been taken very personally by our city attorney's staff. And so I just wanted to issue a public apology. It was unprofessional on my part, you know, and what I try to do up here is direct my criticisms at specific policy, and what ended up happening that night was not that, and that was unprofessional on my part. And I thought about that not only that night, but again today. I was at lunch, and I was sitting at a table, and a young woman came and sat down, and her first comment to me was, "Are you that commissioner?" You know, and you immediately, you've all been there, right? You get in that defensive mode where you think, oh no, you know, what is, and it turned out she wasn't angry at all, but rather wanted to take a minute and applaud some of the work that one of our city staff had done, and said, hey, can you take this back and you know, have a conversation and see to it that this person gets a little bit of praise for what they do. And you know, that comment kind of set in that, you know, our city staff does a ton of great work, and obviously our role up here is to make policy decisions, and it's really important that the political remains separated from the personal. So I just wanted to take a minute and issue an apology for the way that was handled last week by myself. So
thank you, Matt.
Can I speak to your first item? I'm
Please.
sorry, you jumped quickly. Thank you for saying that, though. I think it takes a lot of bravery to have conversations like that. The second one.
Oh.
But I just started, a little brainstorm happened while you were talking about the county and city piece of that, and talking about mental health services. And so as we're entering into those conversations, keeping in mind the fact that there are other cities in this county, and that, you know, they might be interested in being part of some of these conversations, like around the shelter and, you know, other organizations that serve the whole county, even though they're located in our community. I'm not advocating necessarily for inviting every city or anything like that, but I think that we have to be conscious and aware of that, especially if we're going to talk about those broader issues, like some form of UG. Our city isn't the only one that has to be on board with that. And so how can we kind of have the conversation in that and keep that in mind as well? So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, you bet.
I guess I'd like to note the passing of Chancellor Del Shankle. Del was quite a leader in the university community, and he touched a lot of our lives here in the community as well. And I just want to say that I had the highest regard for Del and appreciated knowing him, and that, our thoughts are with his family. City Manager's report.
Yes, the first item on is, that you recall the City Commission requested that we review an incident that occurred at our Board of Zoning Appeals, and I'll read some of this and make some other comments. On June 12, 2018, the City Commission requested staff review a concern raised by a citizen who attended a Board of Zoning Appeal meeting on June 7, 2018. Candace Davis reported that she felt the chair of the BZA, John Gascon, showed hostility toward her at the June 7th and past BZA meetings. Staff from the City Attorney's Office interviewed Ms. Davis, members of the Planning and Development Services staff, members of the BZA in attendance at the June 7th BZA meeting. Staff also listened to the audio recordings of the February 1st and June 7th, 2018 BZA meetings. After this review, it appears to staff that Ms. Davis and Mr. Gascon each have strongly held beliefs about land use and planning matters that are at odds with each other. Further, it is believed this personal dispute between the two individuals spilled over into the public arena. Staff did not identify violations of law or city policy by either party in the encounters reviewed by staff. Resolution number 7224, advisory board members, including BZA members, serve at the will and pleasure of the governing body. And any member of any city advisory board may be removed by a majority vote of the governing body at any time, with or without cause, so as long as such a removal is not otherwise prohibited by law. After being in this business for well over 4 decades, everything kind of gets reduced to quips, I guess. And what I would say is that it's probably always fair to attack the issue, but never the person. And so sometimes I think we let that get in the way of good, healthy debate. And so it's always tempting, and I'm tempted like everybody else, to maybe, get at the person who seems to be getting at you. And if we can keep it on issue and have the passion about the issue and maybe the difference and try to control that conversation, I think we all advance. But when we degrade to going at each other personally, and that's the easier thing to do, unfortunately, I think it hurts all of us. As we watch our Congress right now, and we watch how polarized they are, it has reduced on several occasions to seemingly personal attacks back and forth. And a lot of times it's become so distant that we realize probably the majority of this community is someplace in the middle. And so we have to remember that we're here to do the business of the public. That means me and all of the staff and all of our elected officials and all of our boards and commissions. And so I think we're in the role where we have to be able to absorb some of those shots that come our way on a personal basis and just absorb them. And sometimes that's not easy to do. And I'm vulnerable to slipping on those things too. So I'm not trying to scold anybody. I just think that those things happen, and I think every so often we have reminders where it goes too far, and we need to balance that. So that's all I really had to say about it.
When we were talking, you were thinking that it might be a good idea to have a process in place.
And then and Leslie, then I went back and I kind of looked at it. You have almost full discretion right now, and I think the thing that I would say to you is that having us go back almost as independent
parties in looking at this. I was really pleased with the work that the staff did on this and the interviews and how thorough they were. It was almost like a full-blown investigation. And I think that they came up with a reasonable kind of solution, and I think that's what we try to do is get there. But those of you that know each person, it probably doesn't hurt to remind them that, you know, we're here to do the business, and sometimes people are going to say things that we don't like, and we're held in a position, quite frankly, that we have to be able to deal with that. And we can't necessarily expect everybody that shows up at the meeting and stands up at the mic is going to have that same kind of mindset. They're probably aggrieved on a very personal level, and sometimes it comes out maybe not in ways that they're comfortable with. And the other thing is, we sit up here every meeting, and so we have a way to get acclimated to this process. A lot of times a person stands up at that mic and it's the first time they're there. Now, that's not the case with Candace. Candace is probably just as adept as all as we are. But you know what I'm saying about this situation. We've had people, they start their conversation that is, you know, I'm not comfortable here, this is difficult for me. And so I think we have to think about that as we hear people. And generally, I'd say you folks do an excellent job of giving people their leeway and their comments, and you try to stay away from, you know, any kind of defensive, you know, take on any personal comment that does get made. So, and keep it moving. Couple other things. It's timely that it's ADA week, and I'm sure that staff was thinking about that when they created these training sessions. And I'm not going to go into great detail on it, but we did run a couple of training sessions, and one of the things that I thought was really good about that was that we included both our staff, and we invited engineering firms in the city too, so that they were hearing the same things we were hearing. That's one of the things that I think we need to work on, is ADA accessibility, and not just sidewalks, but in many of our buildings, and we need to pay attention to those things, and I think that's critical. And anyway, I think this training was a good reminder to get all the staff on the same page and some of the engineering firms, so that we're all thinking the same way. This is kind of unique in my experience, but the utilities department had a taste and odor event, which is a new challenge for me. And geosmin is this element that apparently occurs in our raw water from Clinton Lake. And we had an event from June 15th to July 9th, a total of 24 calendar days. It's both a taste and odor consideration, and some people apparently are much more sensitive to this taste and or odor than others. I apparently don't have any of that sensitivity because I never notice it, and people are telling me it's going on. The highest concentration of 364 parts per liter, or whatever that number is, was a record high for the Clinton Water Treatment Plant. The last record high was measured at 219 in June of 2012. So that was a pretty significant event this year. The Clinton plant treatment processes removed roughly 93% of the geosmin on average. This removal was accomplished using powdered activated carbon and plant flow management to optimize the geosmin removal. Again, this is just another example, in my opinion, of how qualified and competent your utilities department is, that they handle those types of issues. Lawrence's green bonds were featured in Governing Magazine. This is kind of the premier magazine for local government and state to across the country. It's been a year since the city of Lawrence issued its first green bonds in Kansas. Our own finance director, Brian, was highly featured right in the front couple paragraphs of this storyline.
He's going to do a book signing after this meeting.
Yeah, he did a good job with that, as a matter of fact. I understand even from reading the article, because I haven't been down to Brian's office for a while, that parts of the bond itself are actually printed in green. And that's kind of a first, isn't it? in bonds. They're usually printed old style. Anyway, future agenda items. If I can find that part of the agenda. Yep. The Women of Color mural is scheduled for the August 7th, 18th agenda, and it's on consent. And that was by my direction, because I want to convey the message that essentially this is approved, and it was subject only to those conditions, and once those conditions are all worked out, meaning the agreement, that it should be a fait accompli, because that's kind of what we said, that we basically approved it, so I put it back on consent. So as long as the agreement terms are satisfactory as directed, then it's my opinion that this could be approved through consent. The regular agenda is a hearing regarding a distance limitation waiver for the Kansas State Fiddling and Picking Championships, and approval of a comprehensive plan amendment to Horizon 2020 Chapter 8 Transportation. And work session items are, get that for
And
me?
the public hearing for the budget.
Oh, and the public hearing for the budget. Probably the most important part of that. Small item. I didn't put that on
Thanks for not
consent.
putting that on.
Yeah. If I have public hearings, you can't get away with it.
Here's the work session.
And then the work session is the fire medical, referred to as the standard of cover, which is basically the accreditation, and Mark will come over and explain that. There may be a couple other items by the time we get to that work session, though, so.
I was asked about marijuana again, when that's gonna come up.
Diane, you're the scheduler.
I think we need to have some discussion about what we understand as staff as desired for that meeting and get it on a calendar, but we have planned to have that discussion tomorrow morning.
There's been some other items there. For
Yeah, we have a
work
bunch of
sessions.
pending.
Yes.
Yeah, so we just don't want to list them here, is that?
Well, we haven't really refined that yet,
Okay.
but we
But
gotta
they're-
have more than that item on.
You're tracking them, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, we are. We just don't have them assigned to a date.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, thank you.
And
That
that's
is-
all I had.
That is something around scheduling that I wanted to ask about, so that we don't get into a position of, like, when we send something out for a study and we're supposed to get it back by contract X number of months in the future, et cetera, if that's something that we can have on future agenda items, even if it's 6 months out, or is that something that you prefer to have, like, just a month out at a time? It just seems like a way to kind of not let any of us forget what we need to at least check in on.
I think what we had at one time, which we could certainly add to this, is we sort of had a listing of to be determined items that hadn't been scheduled for a particular date, and we could easily add that if
So we
that
could
would be
show you that.
desired.
That'd be good, yeah.
Yeah, dropping old business is easy when it's no longer fresh. So for me, it would be helpful.
Sure, and we maintain that list, so that would be
Okay.
no problem.
We can share that.
Thank you very much. Calendar. Okay,
I'd move to adjourn.
Second.
I have a motion from Commissioner Herb. Yeah.
I missed it. You're on calendar?
Yeah,
Okay, so just for the commission's information, Wednesday, July 25th, we're going to talk about the 21st Street Bike Boulevard. We're having a public meeting with the neighborhood. We sent that out to the neighborhoods, but
okay.
I didn't know if more
Yeah,
than,
why don't you,
it's at the Fire Station 5,
you want to throw that on our
room.
calendar, that'd be good.
and it's July 25th, and it is 5:30 to 6:30.
We won't have an additional meeting, before that meeting
Right.
date, so I think Chuck just wanted to make sure that
Right.
it was publicly
Yeah.
announced here.
I imagine
Okay.
there'll be 3 of us there.
There'll probably be some of us there, yeah. So please put it on our calendar. Thank you, Chuck.
Yep.
I really appreciate that.
We don't have a meeting till August now.
Okay, now I would move that we adjourn.
Okay,
One quick
motion.
thing.
Nope, just kidding.
No, not yet.
Did we have
Try to
public
get in a
comment
bit.
on city manager's report?
Oh, thank you very much. Public comment on city
Sorry.
manager's report. Thank you so much, Commissioner. Okay.
Okay, for real this time.
Third time's
I'm going to
charm,
move that
Matthew.
we adjourn, and I'm not going to accept no as an answer.
What if you get voted down?
I'm leaving.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Yes.
Yeah.
Did I hear Commissioner Soto?